Chapter 517. Besides, you've also seen the child. Doyle heaved a sigh of pain. God, we were not so complicated when we were 14 or 15 years old. Shouldn't we be simple, stupid, impulsive, and lustful? He looked at Glover indignantly, seeking approval. There's nothing that cannot be solved by going to Red Street Market at night, right? Against his expectations, Glover, who had always been passive, spoke this time. Not us. The quiet vanguard snorted coldly and turned his head to the side. It's just you. Doyle's smile instantly disappeared. At this moment, another voice rose abruptly. Is everything all right? Doyle and Glover trembled at the same time. In a second, both of them straightened up at the same time and turned in the direction of the Iron Gate. They saw the highest commander of the Royal Guards, the guard captain, Lord Adrian, standing at the Iron Gate. He was accompanied by 2 attendants, and he looked at them with a smile. Doyle looked as if he was struck by lightning. He first tried his best to squeeze out a smile, but when he felt that it was inappropriate, he tried his best to straighten his expression. He stuttered, "DD Captain, CC Commanding Officer?" Glover was also stunned for a moment, but he quickly reacted to the situation. "Commanding Officer." Adrian nodded and walked in with a smile. The people around him recognized him and saluted him one after another. "Everyone is busy. What are the 2 of you doing?" The smile on Doyle's face froze. He quickly stood still and took a step forward. "Ahem. We are evaluating the loopholes in Mindy's Hall's defense and making plans for future centuries." But Glover spoke stiffly and drowned out Doyle's voice. "We are pretending to be busy, Commanding Officer. Then we will avoid being called up by the Logistics Division." When he said this, Captain Adrian's smile also froze for a second. Doyle's body swayed, and he looked at his companion in disbelief. At that moment, Doyle, who first trembled inexplicably, then became completely disheartened. He just wanted to slap Glover to death. Then, he wanted to slap himself to death. In the indescribable silence and awkwardness, the experienced Adrian was the first to react. "Oh, you are all Mallow's men?" Doyle, who was grief-stricken, sensed that the captain did not intend to hold him accountable, so he quickly tried to salvage the situation. Lord Mallows is inside. He seems to be." Glover's answer was as simple as usual. "I'll go inform them." But Adrian stopped him. "Wait." The highest commander of the Royal Guards placed his hands behind his back and slowly walked towards the man. He narrowed his eyes and sized up his robust figure. "You're Caleb Glover from the Vanguard Division?" Glover's expression became stern. "Yes." Adrian nodded, a nostalgic look in his eyes. "Very good. I know your grandfather. 40 years ago, as the watchman, he personally promoted me into the Guards." By the side, Doyle's expression changed. The way he looked at Glover immediately changed. Adrian sighed. He's a stern man, but he deserves respect. Glover's gaze flickered. "Yes, I hope that you will be as respected as him." Adrian's tone was friendly and friendly. "But you don't have to be as strict as him. In a team, be a gentle and easygoing person. You'll find that you'll gain more." Glover shuddered slightly, and his reply sounded a little uneasy. "Yes, yes." Adrian nodded and looked at Doyle. The latter immediately stiffened in an unnatural manner, like a rat that ate poison. Adrian smiled. "So you're that, Doyle?" The corners of Doyle's mouth twitched, and he smiled awkwardly. "Yes, Sea Commanding Officer. But that's just a joke." His voice lacked confidence, and it became weaker. "Bridge told me about you," Adrian said leisurely. "What?" Doyle's eyes lit up, and his previous timidity was gone. "Is that so?" He looked a little expectant. "Then what did the chief say about me?" "He said that you initially wanted to go to the Vanguard Division," Adrian said faintly. "After you failed to get selected, you had no choice but to go to his Guard Division." Glover subconsciously glanced at Doyle. At that moment, Doyle's face flushed red. "Commanding Officer, But Adrian's expression became stern. "It's not shameful to admit defeat," he said slowly. "Only those who can accept defeat are worthy of success. Just like how you need to be a good guard before you could be a vanguard." Adrian's sudden sternness made Doyle subconsciously tense up. "Yes, Commanding Officer." Adrian nodded and looked at the two of them again. Both of you are very young. You are both important arms of Mallows, and also the kingdom's reliable swords. Adrian regained his friendliness from before. Work harder. Yes, commanding officer. This came from Doyle, who was as quiet as a cicada in winter. Yes, commanding officer. This came from Glover, who was still stiff. Adrian smiled faintly. Also, do not get caught by your master when you are slacking off. At this moment, Adrian suddenly turned his head and looked into the distance with a spirited gaze. Especially when he is standing behind you. Doyle and Glover shudder at the same time, and they turn around. Fales, who was hiding behind the tree, was also shocked when he was suddenly discovered. He had to walk out from under the tree, awkwardly under Doyle and Zombie's strange gazes. He adjusted himself and smiled politely and gently. Adrian bowed to him respectfully. Your Grace. Fales quickly nodded and returned the greeting. Lord Adrian. May I know? Adrian smiled and shook his head. Please do not be troubled. I am only here to hand over the official writ of conferring the title of Duke to you. He turned and handed a scroll to Glover. Doyle reached out to take it, but the scroll veered strangely towards Glover just as it was about to fall into his hand. I also want to see how the lads are preparing. The guard captain, who was more than 50 years old, smiled and looked at Doyle and Glover. The former immediately smiled awkwardly, and the latter stood even more stiffly. After all, this is the first time in many years that we have mobilized people from the Royal Guards to form a special unit. Fales looked at the writ in Glover's hands. He did not have the time to delve into the meaning behind the man's words. Thank you for your concern. The guard commander's smile remained. I hope that Tormund did not bring you any trouble. Fales was stunned. Tormund. His first reaction was the portrait of the King of Renaissance in Mindy's Hall. But Adrian only sighed. I heard from Count Casso about the conflict between you and him on the road. I would like to apologize to you for his actions. Fales then realized that the person he was talking about was, but please believe me, Lord Mallows did not mean to be disrespectful, and neither did he want to be stubborn, Adrian said seriously. He's just too casual. Fales blinked. Casual. He took a deep breath and recalled how Mallows told him that no one would care about him just now. So he asked in confusion. That's right. He asked in puzzlement. My personal guard captain? Casual? Even Doyle and Glover, who did not dare to breathe loudly, could not help but look over curiously. Adrian chuckled. Please do not misunderstand, Your Highness. When I said casual, it did not mean that he was lazy or negligent. There is no doubt about Lord Mallows' ability. Adrian looked at Mindy's Hall on the other side of the fountain and said with a myriad of emotions, however, he hates complexity and trouble. When faced with a problem, he would rather choose a solution that is within his reach. This can also be considered a kind of arrogance. Hates complexity and trouble, arrogance. When he heard this comment, Fales understood a little. Adrian said in resignation, for example, the simplest way to protect the prince is to not let the prince go out. But he does not know that sometimes this will bring more trouble. Fales nodded and responded with a smile. Adrian sighed with emotion. So, he often needs someone to push him, goad him into doing better. Doyle and Glover looked at each other. Is that so? Fales nodded politely. I will pay attention. By the way, Lord Mallows is... But Adrian raised his hand. Oh no, I will not see him. The guard captain looked at Fales with a smile. It is enough to see you. 6 years ago, when you became a prince, I was caught up in family matters and could not be there. I missed your important moment. Adrian's gaze suddenly became serious. But fortunately, I did not miss the time when you became a duke. Fales was stunned when he sensed the meaning in Adrian's gaze. Your Highness. Adrian stared at him and said earnestly, don't worry. An excellent warrior can and must go through many trials and tribulations. A qualified noble can and must shoulder a heavy burden. The guard captain said faintly, it is the same for the king. In the next second, he added another sentence with a profound meaning. It is even more so for the king. Fales was stunned. Adrian bowed again, turned around, and left. Watching the guard captain's back disappear, Doyle took a deep breath as if he had been holding it in for a lifetime. Wow, wow, wow. I can't believe it. The guard captain talked to me. Doyle said excitedly. I've been in the team for 7.5 years, and this is the second time I met Commander Adrian face-to-face and talked to him alone. The last time was 3 years ago. Yes, 3 years ago. That time was in the guard room. I think it was something like, Captain, do you want some water? And no, thank you. Doyle thought excitedly. Humph. Glover snorted in disdain. He looked at Doyle with a look that said, You have not seen the world. 3 years. We are both in Renaissance Palace. How marginalized is this boy that he has not had the chance to talk to the commander alone for 3 years? As for me, humph. With faint pride, Glover recalled the conversation he had with the guard captain last time. A few years ago. Strange. Why can't I remember? Thales seemed to be deep in thought as he stood beside the two with different emotions. That is, he said slowly. The excited Doyle answered Thales' doubts. Oh, you still don't know, right? That is the most awesome person in the Royal Guards. Chief Guard Captain, Lord Adrian. Doyle looked smug. His qualifications are enough to crush all the other people in the Royal Guards. He is the witness of glory and destruction. Qualifications? Glory and destruction? Thales was slightly puzzled. Glover nodded and looked in the direction where Adrian left with a stern expression. It is said that the captain has witnessed the bloody year, and he is the only surviving member of the legendary Royal Guards, an old guard. Witnessed the bloody year. Thales' expression changed slightly. Are you talking about the former Royal Guards from my grandfather's time? Doyle sucked in a deep breath and nodded with a yearning expression. When he thought of the prisoners in the prison of bones, Thales could not help but be shocked. Adrian lived through the bloody year? How'd he do it? Glover shrugged. Congratulations, Your Grace. Doyle sighed and spread his hands. You just asked about the third place in the 10 unsolved mysteries of the Royal Guards. Thales was stunned and speechless. At this moment, a commotion suddenly came from outside the iron gate. No. This place is closed today. Even if you are a noble, you cannot. The trio's attention was attracted over. Doyle walked towards the iron gate, and Glover followed closely behind him. The curious Thales also wanted to go forward, but Glover pressed him behind him and blocked him. What happened? Doyle called out to a Jadestar private soldier outside the gate through the iron gate. The soldier turned around and pointed indignantly at a man who was blocked by a few other soldiers in the distance. Protector, this guy wants a barge in. He said he is a noble, or else we would have. Doyle narrowed his eyes and saw the man who was blocked clearly. His eyes immediately widened. Wait, I know him. Doyle stared at the man who was waving at him outside the gate. Why are you here? The man outside the gate struggled to break free from the soldier's oppression. He straightened his clothes, and when he saw Doyle, he was equally surprised. Hey, I'm the one who wants to ask Doyle, why are you here? Doyle's expression darkened. Nonsense, I am a Royal Guard. No. I asked you first, why are you here? The man outside the gate blinked. He looked around, and he seemed to be very puzzled. It's me. Behind Glover, Thales burst out laughing when he heard the baffling conversation between the two. Glover looked at him strangely. Nothing, it's just... Thales waved his hand apologetically. I remembered a joke the Northlanders tell. Why are you here? Thales could not help but laugh again. He did not understand. Glover's expression became even stranger. Outside the gate, the baffling conversation between Doyle and the uninvited guest continued. Why are you here? Why? The guest scratched his head. I applied for leave in advance today. I purposely came here to see the prince. Oh no, the Duke now. I heard that he came back today. Doyle shook his head. No, nobles have to make an appointment to visit, but Doyle reacted. Wait, how did you know that the prince came back today? And how did you know that he is the Duke? Ah, my messenger crow is faster. All right, move aside. Don't block my way to see him. No, how did you know that he is here? Did you forget that when you sent the prince here today, we were in charge of clearing the path? No. Wait a little longer. I mean, who are you? What right do you have to come and visit the prince? Are you kidding me? At my age, I'm the only promising youth in our hall who has been conferred the title of a lord. Conferred the title of a lord? Are you saying that because you have strong connections, a strong background, and a good father, you got the title of a foppish young master? Bah, get lost. I was conferred the title of a lord because of my meritorious service to the kingdom. Meritorious service. Are you talking about catching thieves on the streets? Catching you. It was my heroic expedition 6 years ago to protect the kingdom from the flames of war. Heh, I'll see how long you want to brag. Let me tell you, Doyle, you're just jealous. You're jealous because you can't make a name for yourself. Bah, you've been single for more than 20 years. Do you have any shame? Behind the iron door, Glover pressed his hand on his head with a face full of shame. Obviously, Doyle's negotiation with the man outside the door would not end anytime soon. The Jade Star private soldiers who were tired of listening had already returned to their posts. But Thales heard something from it. Doyle. Ignoring Glover's expression, the Duke of Star Lake walked past him decisively and reminded him loudly, Doyle. In front of the iron door, Doyle, who had been arguing endlessly, finally snapped out of his daze and remembered his duty. He quickly turned around and smiled apologetically. My apologies, Your Highness, for disturbing you. Let me introduce, this is... Doyle turned sideways and pointed at the uninvited guest outside the door. He awkwardly shouted a string of nouns. My grandmother's brother-in-law's grandnephew. Glover sighed again and pressed his palm against his face. At that moment, Thales saw the guest outside the door clearly. He was stunned. The heir to a certain count's territory. He's working and on vacation in the capital. Doyle laughed dryly and said the person's name. Cohen Caribbean. Thales stared at the man outside the door in a daze. Hey, Your Highness. Do you remember me? I'm the one who eats a lot of fruits and liver. Outside the iron door, the tall police officer Cohen looked at Thales, who had grown up quite a bit, in surprise. He then pointed at himself and revealed a mouthful of white teeth, revealing a silly smile that said, It's me. Doyle looked at Cohen, who was trying his best to wave in horror. He coughed awkwardly. By the way, Your Highness. Doyle did not notice his master's strange behavior. He lowered his voice and moved his head close to Thales' ear. The nobles in the capital are all talking about this guy. Doyle pointed at Cohen, who could not stop smiling and waving his hand. He nodded discreetly and whispered confidently, There's something wrong with his brain. Chapter 518. Obviously, as the captain of the Duke of Star Lake's personal guards, Mallows was not happy to see Thales welcome guests on the first day he moved into his new residence. But under the watchful eyes of countless bureaucrats, servants, and guards, the insistence of the second prince, and the pressure from young Master Caribbean's family background, Cohen was politely invited into the freshly prepared guest hall. Of course, before that, the captain of the Duke's personal guards, Watchman Lord Mallows, did not forget to remind his master. He was the heir of the Caribbean family, and today was the prince's first day back in the capital. This must mean something. Hearing this reminder, Thales could only smile numbly. Then, as always, he tensed up. To face the person in the guest hall, I knew it. I told him that the prince's memory is not bad, and he would definitely remember me. He would definitely not forget to fight side by side with me. As expected, I've been writing to you for the past few years, Your Highness, but I don't know why, but you never replied to me. Until one time, I met Casso, who had just returned to his hometown. He told me that the Star Killer intercepted most of the letters he wrote to you. Thales sat on the main seat and looked at the chattering Cohen. He glanced at the familiar guest hall and tried hard to suppress the emotions in his heart. Back then, I was here, Cohen paused. He looked at the absent-minded Thales and raised his palm to measure from his stomach to his chest. He said in surprise, Hey, you've grown taller? Grown taller. Thales looked at the chair he was sitting on and remembered 6 years ago. Maybe. Back then, when I was sitting here, my feet could not even touch the ground. Thales was silent for a long time. It was so long that Cohen was at a loss. He subconsciously sat up straight in the chair. Yes. Thales finally spoke. His smile was faint, but it was meaningful. I've grown taller. But Cohen's smile faded. He looked at the open door to the hall. There, Mallows was standing at the door with his arms crossed. He was sizing up his two subordinates with a smile and occasionally glanced at the meeting in the hall from the corner of his eyes. The police officer was cautious. Did I come at the wrong time? Thales shifted his gaze. Cohen scratched his head. They don't look very happy, especially the leader. Look, the one with the fake smile. Outside the open door, a maid was about to serve tea and snacks to the Duke and the guest, but she was stopped by Mallows, who smiled and raised his hand. Doyle, who had a bitter expression, and Glover, who was as stiff as ever, went forward together and began to inspect them. He wasn't happy about it. Of course, Thales thought indifferently. Although they hadn't spent much time together from the moment he walked out of the conference hall, obviously, even Cohen had sensed something. When he thought of this and recalled Mallows' words, Thales forced himself to smile. That's Mallows. Tormund Mallows, watchman of the Royal Guards. So that's how it is. Cohen had a look of realization, and he was filled with respect. It's the famous Mallows. Mallows, this name does sound a little familiar. Cohen struggled desperately with his memories. Where did I hear it coming from? Thales adjusted his emotions and smiled. Don't mind him, he's just a little stricter. After all, this is my first day back, and Mallows is my personal guard captain. Cohen quickly put the family name he could not recall to the back of his mind. Personal guard captain. Wow, Your Highness. Cohen looked pleasantly surprised. He looked back and forth at the layout of the guest hall. Compared to Northland, it's a lot more upgraded, right? The police officer looked around excitedly and curiously. Mindy's Hall. I was only brought here once by the old man when I was very young. He said that this is a good place and that it has an extraordinary meaning. Cohen happily patted his chair. Who knows? This seat of mine has sat on many important people. Yes, 6 years ago, Thales said, not without nostalgia. The Black Prophet sat on that chair of yours. Cohen, who was in high spirits, froze. Thales smiled faintly as he recalled the intense meeting that year. I wonder how I'll react when I face Murat Hansen again, 6 years later? The prince unknowingly clenched his fists. 6 years ago, the Black Prophet was mysterious, terrifying, and creepy in his mind. But 6 years later, he knew that the Black Prophet was not that terrifying, was he? At least, the Black Prophet had his legs broken before. In front of him, Cohen moved parallel to him and changed his seat without batting an eyelid. You might not believe it, but the time the old man brought me here, he was summoned by the Crown Prince. I suddenly needed to pee, but my servant disappeared. I couldn't find the place, but I suddenly found a vase in the corridor. Cough, cough. Doyle, who was coughing loudly, walked over with tea and snacks, interrupting Cohen's unconscious narration. Cohen, Doyle's tone was normal, but he glared at the guest from an angle that Thales could not see. This is His Highness's palace, and thanks to His Highness' generosity, you could be the first to visit this place. Mind your manners. Cohen snorted and did not care. He looked like he was very familiar with the prince as he watched Doyle leave. Then, he picked up his teacup and downed it in a show of force. In the next second, the police officer's expression changed, and he spat the tea back into the teacup. Oh, F asterisk CK, F asterisk CK, F asterisk CK, F asterisk CK. Cohen stuck out his scalded tongue and fanned himself in a disheveled manner. Thales watched the interaction between Cohen and Doyle in surprise. He picked up his own teacup and tested it. The temperature is just right. Under Cohen's indignant gaze, Thales coughed to break the awkwardness. So, you've known Doyle for a long time? Ha. Damn it. Dee-dee-do. Oh, you mean Doyle. Cohen finally smoothed out his tongue. He's my... That Cohen's tone was a little uncertain. Some great-uncle's brother-in-law's grandson. Probably. Some great-uncle's brother-in-law's grandson. To think that he remembered. Thales looked at Cohen's bright blonde hair, and then at Doyle's dark blonde hair. He suddenly felt a little better. At the very least, the oppressive feeling from Renaissance Palace was no longer like a dark cloud pressing down on him, making it hard for him to breathe. Cohen's expression changed. He moved closer to Thales and whispered to Doyle's back. But you better not play with him too much, Your Highness. That guy is a playboy. All right. Thales' expression was strange, but he could not help but curl up the corners of his lips. Judging by the fact that he snitched on me, you guys are really relatives? So, Where's the boy from the Casso family? The one with the single-edged sword? Cohen did not pay attention to this small interlude. He straightened his back and searched for the figure that he remembered. And that smoking uncle who is very good at scheming? Cohen scratched his chin and recalled. Including the mute who fanned himself. Cohen paused for a moment and asked suspiciously, "Wait, the mute isn't here, right? Why a Casso? Putre Neiman, Madeira Ralph." Thales was slightly absent-minded. "They're still in Northland dealing with the matters I left behind, but they'll be back soon." The prince quickly snapped out of his daze and answered flawlessly. Cohen breathed a sigh of relief and touched his throat warily. It's better if I don't run into that mute." Looking at Cohen's expression, and then at the unfamiliar yet familiar environment, Thales realized that he missed his old acquaintances even more. "It's hard to imagine, Your Highness." In just a few seconds, Cohen regained his energy and was full of excitement. 6 years ago, we were still in Northland, fighting and killing together. The police officer's enthusiasm towards the prince made it difficult for the latter to resist. "But look at this place again, Your Highness. You're a duke now, the Duke of Star Lake." Cohen took a deep breath and his face lit up. He seemed to have thought of something exhilarating. "Even my old man has to bow to you." "But you didn't bow." Thales rubbed his forehead in resignation. "So why Mindy's Hall?" Cohen patted the chair with undiminished interest. "You're still underage. Why not Renaissance Palace?" Thales wanted to answer, but he hesitated. He glanced at the royal guards outside the door. "My body is weak, and I'm afraid of the cold." Thales recalled the story of the Fog King who left the palace to recuperate. He smiled and said, "My father let me stay here." Thales felt a little stifled. He suddenly realized that compared to 6 years ago, he could no longer treat his friends without any grudges or reservations. "Afraid of the cold?" Cohen looked at him in surprise. "But you stayed in Northland for 6 years. Tyre Van forced a smile. "Maybe that's why they sent me back. To prevent me from freezing and dying in Northland." Cohen was stunned. With a face full of suspicion, he sized up the prince in front of him again. A second later, "Ah." Cohen reacted as if he had a sudden realization. His smile reappeared. "Your Highness, you're really good at joking. Afraid of the cold? You're the hero who charged into heroic Spirit Palace and saved Dragon Cloud City." Thales could only continue to smile. "But you can't fool me." At this point, the police officer's eyes lit up. "So, how did you come back from Northland?" Thales' smile froze. It was another difficult question to answer. Although the announcement said that Extet sent you back as a gift, and at the same time, their king sent his regards to his majesty, Cohen seemed to be deep in thought. His eyes shone with a shrewd light. "But I'm a man who fought in Northland and Western Desert. I know that place very well, so I know that things." Cohen smiled mysteriously. "It's definitely not that simple." Thales was shocked. But unexpectedly, Cohen looked confident and did not intend to question him further. "I know." The police officer snapped his fingers as if he knew what was going on. "This year, whether it's the war in the Alliance of Freedom, the civil strife in Black Sand region, or other things, it's just the surface of things." Looking at Cohen in front of him, Thales was a little surprised. "He means, and the truth is, someone with ulterior motives has already planned everything in secret." Cohen waved his hand. His face was filled with an expression that said, "I know, stop pretending. Only for your safe return." At that moment, Thales was shocked. "What? Cohen? When did he? Is it the Secret Intelligence Department? Did Raphael tell him?" Not only that, I also know that the person with ulterior motives," the police officer had a shrewd look on his face. "And the person who planned all of this." Thales looked at him a little nervous. He had to admit that the Cohen in front of him gave him an unfathomable feeling that made him look at him in a different light. Cohen stood up abruptly and said in an imposing manner, "It's you, Your Highness." The entire guest hall fell silent. Only Cohen's voice floated in the guest hall, lingering. The police officer maintained a handsome posture of pointing out the culprit, looking valiant and confident. At the tip of his finger, Thales froze on the spot. Doyle, who was outside the door, looked in curiously but was forced back by a smile from Mallows. After a few seconds, Thales, who had recovered, tried to open his mouth. Huh. But Cohen seemed to have practiced it beforehand. He changed his footsteps, retracted his right hand, and swung his right arm. He said confidently, "I know you too well, Your Highness. I know that someone as quick-witted as you is the one who started all the schemes." Cohen was excited. Just like 6 years ago, this time you were also the one who came up with the strategy. You used the Alliance of Freedom and the vassals of Black Sand region to successfully instigate the internal strife between Dragoncloud City and Black Sand region. Thales's eyebrows began to twitch. When the two great forces were fighting against each other and had no time to care about each other, you successfully escaped and returned to the country safely, and you severely weakened Extet's strength. Cohen's posture did not diminish. He knew that at that moment, his eyes were shining with wisdom. He waited for the person in front of him to respond. Before Cohen's expectant gaze, Thales squeezed his eyebrows as hard as he could. Not bad, more or less." Cohen's eyes brightened when he received confirmation. "Those Northland barbarians." The police officer was very happy. "You must have taught them a lesson, didn't you?" Thales took a deep breath. Not bad, more or less." Cohen became even more excited. "That's why you, who contributed to the country, were conferred the title of Duke the moment you came back." When he heard this, Thales answered numbly, not bad, more or less." When he heard the prince admit it, Cohen retracted his arms and clenched his fists. Yeah, he was completely unaware of Thales's complicated expression at that moment. How is it? Ever since I learned my lessons 6 years ago, I've been cramming in politics for the past few years." The police officer narrowed his eyes and crossed his arms, looking very knowledgeable. "My resourcefulness has also improved, hasn't it?" Thales quietly looked at Cohen, who was beaming with joy. "Yes." A few seconds later, Thales broke into an awkward smile. Yes. Cohen instantly beamed like a squirrel that had found a pine cone. "So, how have the Northlanders treated you over the years?" Thales had yet to recover from the shock of Cohen's intelligence. He sighed. How should I say this?" But Cohen, who was brimming with confidence, waved his hand and interrupted him. "Oh, I get it." Cohen looked up and empathized. "When I was in the Tower of Eradication, my teacher was a Northlander. Strictly speaking, Miranda is also a Northlander. Cohen seemed to have remembered something and shuddered. The police officer was halfway through his disgusted expression when he suddenly turned around and narrowed his eyes at Thales. "You get it?" Thales stared at him blankly. Facing Cohen's expectant and longing gaze, the prince could only try his best to smile. "Yes, I get it. See?" Cohen slapped his thigh excitedly. "I knew you would get it." Thales tried hard to suppress the twitching of his lips. Cohen sighed. "Unfortunately, no one else gets it." But he immediately perked up. He looked at the confused prince eagerly, as if he was looking at his own younger brother. "But it's okay, it's enough that we get it." Thales could only follow Cohen's lead. He smiled foolishly and nodded, suppressing that terrifying question. "What do I get?" For the first time in this fruitful conversation, the Duke of Star Lake felt that his intelligence level was slightly lacking. Just as Thales was immersed in the sadness of his damaged intelligence, Cohen suddenly stood up and slapped his thigh. "All right, I should go." Thales was instantly stunned. "Go? Now?" The police officer said with a smile. "Your Highness, take care." Thales looked at the happy Cohen and asked doubtfully, That's it?" Cohen blinked, as if he did not quite understand. "Yes." Thales was stunned for a few seconds before he said, "Don't you have anything else to do?" "Yes." Cohen's eyes darted around, and his mood became dejected. "I have to go to the office in the afternoon to sign in, or else the director will deduct. Wait. That's it. As the heir of one of the 13 distinguished families, on the first day the second prince returned to the capital. No probing, no roping, no ulterior motives, no flattery, no threats, no temptations, no conspiracies. There's nothing Mallows reminded me of. Everything." The Duke stared blankly at the dejected Cohen before him. For the first time since returning to Constellation, Thales felt a little out of sorts. Thales snapped out of his daze and shook his head. No, the prince hesitated for a moment. He looked at Cohen with a somewhat solemn gaze. How is your father? Thales still spoke, with a hint of discomfort and guilt. Walla Hills. Count Caribbean? Cohen was also stunned. Him? I don't know. You should be quite well. It's been a long time since I wrote to him. The young duke was a little surprised. But you came all the way here today just to spend a few minutes chatting with me? Cohen paused for a moment and sank into deep thought. A few seconds later, he shrugged after thinking hard but to no avail. Yes, I just came to see you. The police officer scratched his head. He looked confused. What else? This time, it was Thales' turn to be stunned. At that moment, the legendary wing, nor from the Secret Intelligence Department, the Duke of Western Desert, Darachroma, the Count of Black Lion, Watchman Mallows, Gilbert, Guard Captain Adrian. The faces of many people he had met since he returned to the kingdom flashed in Thales' mind. But, compared to the person before me, Thales looked at the silly Cohen in front of him with mixed feelings. The large police officer also stared at him in puzzlement and blinked. After a long while, the Duke, who had a lot of emotions, snapped out of his daze and took a deep breath. Cohen, you are the eldest son, right? The Caribbean family of the Sword of the Twin Towers. The moment he heard the word eldest son, Cohen looked like a frosted eggplant. He became listless. Yes, Cohen said listlessly. Thales quietly stared at the young master of the Caribbean family, the legitimate heir of Walla Hill. So, after you graduated from the Tower of Eradication, you went straight to Western Desert? You went to Lightning Raven? The police officer waved his hand. Yes, your father didn't stop you. Thales gently rubbed the teacup in his hand. You know, you were the heir to the family's territory and title. Oh, speaking of this, Cohen tried hard to pull himself together and face these headache-inducing matters. My old man, wait, how did you know that I served in Western Desert and went to Lightning Raven? The police officer looked at him suspiciously. However, Thales' expression did not change. Everyone knows. Cohen thought about it seriously and came to a realization. That's right, everyone knows. As for my father, of course, he stopped me. He didn't want me to join the army, and he didn't want me to go to Western Desert. What I mean is, Cohen answered thoughtfully, but his tone gradually became gloomy. At least he tried to stop me. Thales stared deeply at Cohen. For the first time, he felt that he saw something different in this big man. But you still went, the prince said quietly. Cohen exhaled slowly. I still went. The living room was silent for a while. It seemed that both sides needed time to digest these few words. After that, did he not pressure you? Thales stared at the reflection in the teacup and asked absent-mindedly. Forced you to go back and become a qualified heir? Cohen shuddered slightly, as if he had recalled some bad memories. But he still smiled. Of course. You can't imagine. There was a hint of regret at the end of Cohen's words. The way he forced me to leave the army, he did not continue. But you are still here, Thales said faintly. In the capital? Yes. The police officer was also slightly absent-minded. At least in the capital, the old man does not dare to act recklessly. Cohen sighed and sounded resigned. If I leave the capital, I suspect that he will send an army to kidnap me. Ahem. Cohen shrugged and flashed his usual grin. As cheerful as ever. Thales looked at him quietly. He's smiling. The prince told himself. Cohen. At that moment, Thales suddenly felt that I'm not alone. There was another period of silence between them. Mallows knocked on the door softly from afar. It was time to meet the guest. Cohen. Thales put down the teacup in his hand and slowly raised his head. Thank you. The prince showed his warmest and most sincere smile that day. It's nice to meet you. Cohen raised his eyebrows. Yes, I'm also, but the police officer was interrupted. Thales continued to speak to himself. I could see my old face. It's nice. Thales' expression was indifferent, but his words were profound. The moment he finished speaking, Cohen's expression changed. He looked at the prince in a daze, puzzled. What's wrong? Thales smiled. Cohen narrowed his eyes, as if he wanted to carefully size up the master of Mindy's Hall. You're different. Thales could not help but laugh. Is that so? You think so too? Cohen nodded in all seriousness. Yes, you've changed. He tried his best to scan the Duke of Star Lake in front of him. In the end, Cohen, who could not think of an adjective for a long time, could only force out one sentence. Changed. Bigger. Thales snickered. Looking at the prince's smile, Cohen frowned. He turned his head and remembered the child he held under his armpit in the tunnel all those years ago. Yes, he was cuter when he was young. A thought flashed in Thales' mind, and he remembered something. Right? Do you remember Ralph? Cohen's thoughts were in a mess. He said blankly, Ralph what? My subordinate, the one with the mask. You mean? Cohen thought deeply at first, then came to a realization. Mute. Looking at Cohen's happy expression, Thales sighed. This might be a bad idea. But Cohen. Thales paused for a moment, but still looked up. This time, the prince's expression was extremely serious. I want to ask for a small favor. In private. Chapter 519. His Majesty's warrant has been officially issued. Gilbert, who sat opposite him, was full of smiles. He raised his teacup and took a sip. Now, the news of your return and title has spread throughout Eternal Star City. In a few days, the entire Central Territory and even the entire country will know about it. While in the living room, Thales smiled helplessly as the host and not a guest. With the laziness of waking up in the morning, the teenager stood up and slowly walked to the window. The morning light shone through the curtains and illuminated the low-key but tidy guest hall. Thales pulled the window open and was greeted by fresh air. There was also a sudden, piercing noise. Yes, the new Duke of Star Lake leaned against the window and yawned. He pressed his waist. I can feel it from here. Mindy's hall was not peaceful under the window. The garden and the road outside the Iron Gate were filled with all kinds of carriages, and this was not counting the many visitors who came on foot or on horseback. Some of them were dressed in luxurious clothes and had obvious emblems. Outside the Iron Gate, the Royal Guards and Jadestar Private Army were doing their best to explain and dissuade the visitors. Thales leaned close to the window. The sin of Hell's river surged into his ears, and he managed to catch some scattered words. I'm sorry, Your Grace, Mindy's Hall does not receive guests this month. Vanguard Glover's stiff and stern voice came from behind the Iron Gate. Only His Majesty's special warrant can pass. Then, another slightly agitated voice drowned out Glover's words. No, Luke, I've been your classmate for 4 years, but I've never been close to you. So, unrelated people are all. What? You're just here to look at the scenery? That's enough. Looking at the scenery for 2 days in a row for 8 hours? Do you think I'm an idiot? It was Doyle. At that moment, he stood in front of an innocent-looking noble and waved at Mindy's Hall behind him in exasperation. It's so noisy every day. It's so noisy every day. I don't need to. Doesn't the prince need to rest? Thales could not help but raise his eyebrows. Another voice, appropriate and gentle, intruded upon his ears. Then, Honorary Viscount Kemar. It was Mallows, who had a faint smile on his face, but was actually aloof. He was facing another noble who was not easy to deal with. Why don't you go to the heir of the Caribbean family and ask him what's the secret to making an exception and meeting the Duke? Oh, so your family is a royal merchant, and you have 3 beautiful daughters ranging from 9 to 19 years old, who are likely to become the prince's concubines. My apologies. Perhaps, as the future royal relative, you will definitely be able to obtain His Majesty's grace. If you come to visit at that time, I will definitely line up to welcome you. Yes, the Mallows family is very grateful for your care. It's really sad that we can't buy your family's goods. Thank you for asking about my parents and family, although they're no longer alive. Well, then on behalf of all my female relatives who are still alive, I thank you and your organ for the greetings. Yes, Sir Viscount. I will definitely bring your words to my ancestral grave and let my ancestors know. But before that, for the safety of the Duke of Star Lake, I will temporarily detain you at the police station. Why? Because I suspect that you have hidden a weapon and that you intend to harm the Duke. Where's the weapon? Look, the jewel on your ring is too bright. It is harmful to the Duke's eyes. Then I suggest that you directly complain to His Majesty or Lord Adrian about my service attitude. How long will you be detained for? Don't worry, There are only 2.5 months left until the Duke's welcome banquet. After that, your plan will fail, and the royal guards will officially file a lawsuit against you for plotting to assassinate the royal family." When he heard this, Thale sighed and pulled down the window. He no longer listened to the pot-bellied Viscount Kyle's panicked self-defense. He also no longer cared about how he fled back to his carriage with a terrified expression on his face. This was the third day since he returned to the capital and entered Mindy's Hall. From his second day onwards, Mindy's Hall was crowded with visitors. There was an endless stream of visitors. It was so noisy that the Star Lake guards could not rest. A few days ago, you should not have met the heir of Caribbean, even if he is your old friend. Gilbert put down his teacup and sighed. Now, many of the nobles, officials, and influential people in the capital are following suit. They want to use their connections to get in. Yes, I understand now. Thale sat back in his seat and said absent-mindedly, "This is the price." He underestimated the influence and impact of his return to the kingdom. The prince did not just attract visitors. Obviously, the Duke of Star Lake's residence had not only awakened the usually quiet Mindy's Hall. In the past 3 days, the mansion's standard had been upgraded, and it affected the entire Eternal Star City. The City Hall issued 6 emergency orders to repair the greenery, change the lights, clean all the streets in Twilight District that the prince could see, and decorate them magnificently. Not a single refugee was allowed to enter, and not a single beggar could be seen. The city's appearance was greatly improved, and to a certain extent, it was even better than Eastern City District, where the nobles gathered. The police station rearranged their patrol schedule and manpower arrangements. The 3 police stations in Twilight District and the 2 adjacent districts, who were originally at odds with each other, became united, friendly, and worked together sincerely. Countless police officers fought to be the first to work conscientiously. Batches of public security teams went back and forth, patrolling day and night, turning this awkward and almost forgotten area into a paradise on Earth where no one would pick up anything that was left on the road, and the doors would not be closed at night. The chief garrison officer of Eternal Star City hastily increased the number of city defense teams on the city wall of Twilight District, even though Twilight District was thousands of miles away from the city wall, to ensure that no thieves or rascals can get past U.S. and threaten the prince. He also specially requested for a warrant to mobilize the regular army from outside the city and set up a special route to clear the path for Mindy's Hall supply and logistics transportation. According to a certain soldier, even the prince's poop that is transported out is not allowed to be tainted by others. Thales pressed his forehead listlessly. Gilbert smiled in resignation. I can already imagine when I return home. I have probably never been so popular in my life. As His Majesty's most trusted vassal, you have always been popular. Thales exhaled. And believe me, compared to the Constellations, the extensions will welcome you more. Gilbert nodded in realization. Over the past few days, other than the large group of speculators who had stretched their necks and were waiting outside the wall, eager to try their luck to meet the prince, life in Mindy's Hall was rather peaceful. He slept until he woke up, had breakfast, moved around freely, had lunch, slept until he woke up, moved around freely, had dinner, moved around freely, and slept until he woke up. Oh, right. Basically, I can't go outside when I move around freely, because I have to avoid the paparazzi. Ahem. I mean, avoid the fanatical speculators who wish to meet the prince, but are unable to. Even though the pace of life was similar to when he was in Dragon Cloud City, but there was no scheming and plotting against each other, no uneasiness because the enemy was in the dark while he was in the light, no constant high-pressure feeling like an arrow was knocked on a bowstring, no nervousness and excitement from surviving in a desperate situation, and no crazy journey of fleeing for thousands of miles. No one bothered, no one interfered, and no one questioned him. He was really a little not used to it. Thales picked up the teacup and moistened his throat in satisfaction. Compared to 6 years ago when he lived here as a guest and had to go through Gilbert for everything, there were still benefits to him becoming the owner of this place 6 years later. At least he could directly give orders to the people around him, such as, "Get me a harder mattress," and his words would be obeyed, at least on the surface. These days, they are indeed. Thales slowly leaned back and let out a heartfelt sigh that was unique to a worm. It's so depressing. He had almost forgotten about the person in Renaissance Palace, that person. So, Gilbert, where are our plans for today? Thales pointed at the table gloomily. Why did you bring a pile of paper? Gilbert, who was looking at the Duke lovingly, turned his head around as if he had suddenly remembered something. He moved the stack of paper on the table to his knees and took out a pair of spectacles at the same time. Please forgive me. I am old, and my eyes are not as good as before. The Foreign Affairs Minister, who was past his middle age, said in embarrassment. His spectacles were very special. They were a pair of handheld folding glasses. There was no frame, but a handle was specially made on the right side of the frame. By the way, the gift you requested for the Archduchess was ordered from the same handmade spectacles workshop. As Gilbert spoke, he lifted the spectacles to cover his eyes and began to flip through the papers on his knees. I do not know what you are thinking, but they are, after all, custom-made spectacles for scholars and old men like me. The color design is not fancy, nor is it trendy. I reckon that it will not please young ladies. Did you not think of giving something else in the first place? There is an underlying meaning in the Foreign Affairs Minister's words, but Thales, who had been through many battles, remained calm. He pretended that he did not hear anything. Then, first of all, Gilbert did not know whether it was because he saw that the prince had no reaction or because he had finally found the target on the paper, but he still sighed softly and said, Your welcome banquet is initially set to be held 2 months later. The new Duke of Star Lake will be officially introduced to the entire kingdom, or at least all of Eternal Star City. The Foreign Affairs Minister still had his head lowered, but he glanced at Thales from the top of his spectacles. Introduced to the entire kingdom. Thales felt a chill in his heart. He took a deep breath and sat up straight in his chair. The laziness and comfort he had felt over the past few days were instantly swept away. It's about time. He sighed and told himself, Wake up, Thales. Other than the noble master of shit-shoveling, how can there be a happy worm in the world? Thales pulled himself together. And what about the past 2 months? Gilbert lifted his eyes from the paper. It is time for you to rest, adapt, and adjust. That long? Gilbert shook his head and denied it. No, it is not long at all. In fact, it is a little too short. After all, you have stayed in Northland for 6 years. The Foreign Affairs Minister sized Thales up. He looked at Thales' habitual posture, which made him seem undisciplined, but in reality, he was sitting with his elbows propped up, and he could roll to the ground at any moment. His gaze was sharp and direct, and he did not avoid Thales' gaze at all. He also wore casual clothes that were convenient for him to move around, but were not very dignified. He frowned in a barely noticeable manner. From the way of speech, mannerisms, habits, etiquette, and knowledge, there are too many things we need to correct. This time, it was Thales' turn to frown. Correct? Speech, mannerisms, habits? Gilbert noticed that he had made a slip of the tongue. I am sorry. I did not mean to be disrespectful, but what I meant was that there are too many things we need to prepare. The Foreign Affairs Minister glanced at Thales. His tone was respectful and cautious. Forgive me for being straightforward. Even though you made a stunning appearance during the national conference, that was 6 years ago. During these 6 years, aside from bits and pieces of news, no one understands you. Now, they only know that Prince Thales has just returned from the boorish, barbaric, dangerous, and bitter Northland. He grew up under the influence and education of those unreasonable boorish Northlanders. Gilbert performed a standard salute and said sincerely, and what we need to show them is... Thales leaned against the back of his chair and pressed his head in resignation. I understand now. You could have told me directly. The young Duke of Star Lake sighed deeply. Everyone from the top to the bottom of the kingdom is suspecting whether the second prince's thoughts have been distorted by the barbaric and perverted Northland barbarians. His personality has been corrupted, his brain has been beaten silly, and his sexual orientation has been changed. After all, in their eyes, all extensions are illiterate. So, they might even suspect whether the heir who returned to the kingdom is only a prince of Constellation on the outside, but a boorish illiterate from Northland on the inside. After he finished speaking, Thales exhaled in annoyance. Trapped me for 6 years. 6 years. Are you satisfied? All right, Chapman. You want a chess piece, I guess. Thales thought in a bored manner. I did not say that. Gilbert smiled cheerfully, but his expression immediately became stern. But sexual orientation. You're joking, right? Thales could not be bothered to end this small tease. He continued, and what all you need to do is to make me more local, more dignified, more acceptable, and more constellation before I show my face? Not entirely, Your Highness. On the surface, Gilbert let go of the joke that did not make Thales feel at ease. He smiled again and said, in fact, your trip to Northland is one of the most eye-catching things you have done. It is like the legendary journey of a mercenary, unfamiliar and mysterious, and it attracts awe and amazement from those who do not know about it. Those who do not know about it. Thales mocked himself in his heart. But when Gilbert mentioned mercenaries, he suddenly thought of Quick Rope and then the mysterious and terrifying Ricky. So, we might as well keep some of the marks that Dragon Cloud City left for you. Thales snapped out his days. Marks? Gilbert smiled and nodded. Let the others know the advantage of being on both sides of the border, Duke Thales. You are the only one in this era who has received the inheritance of the Empire and Constellation, and has also been honed by the Northern Wind and the Great Dragon. You can debate with the officials in Renaissance Palace, and you can also survive in a desperate situation in Heroic Spirit Palace, God's favored one. The air was quiet for a second. Thales lowered his head and subconsciously rubbed his face in front of the Foreign Affairs Minister, whose eyes shone brightly. Damn it, as expected of someone in the field of diplomacy. Compared to packaging the country bumpkin Thales, these words were rather pretty. The cunning fox of Constellation's power has not diminished, Thales thought with a sigh. Just a few appropriate and harmless words were enough to dispel the unhappiness in his heart. In this regard, he was as different as the clouds and mud from Poutre, that gloomy little old man who spoiled his mood. Perhaps this was the reason why one of the two people who worked together in the Foreign Affairs Department could rise to become the king's trusted aide and become famous in the Western Peninsula. The other person was constantly on the move and worked hard every day. No matter how many merits he had, no one knew about it. Thales thought to himself quietly, all right, if I am really illiterate, Gilbert. A few seconds later, Thales adjusted his emotions and replied with a smile as well. Then, isn't it a little too late for you to start eliminating illiteracy at the age of 14? Others may not understand, Your Highness, but I am your full-time teacher. When he talked about the past, Gilbert could not help but feel sentimental. I have only gone through 6 years of breaks between classes. He winked at Thales. So, do you still remember how to compose a sonnet? Thales and Gilbert chuckled at the same time. But unexpectedly, as they laughed, Gilbert suddenly spoke. So, it is only 6 years of breaks. His voice became deeper. Your Highness, 6 years. Thales stopped smiling and looked at the Foreign Affairs Minister strangely. Do not be discouraged, child. Gilbert did not look at him. He only spoke slowly. You have to know, sometimes fathers make mistakes. Thales was stunned. Give him time, Your Highness, Gilbert said airily. Give him time. He choked a little. The temperature and light in the reception room seemed to have sunk at that moment. Thales was silent as he pondered deeply. Gilbert did not speak either. The two of them just sat opposite each other in silence. After a long while, finally, Thales took a deep breath and smiled. Gilbert. The prince looked at the middle-aged man who once taught him how to read, who was once in the prime of his life, but now had gray hair and looked exhausted. Thank you. Gilbert forced himself to smile and reined in his emotions. For what? Thales lowered his head. After a while, the corners of his lips curled up. For everything. There was silence. For a moment, there was only the faint noise outside the window. No, Your Highness. Everything, Gilbert sighed. It is all for you. Thales did not speak. Your Highness. Gilbert swept his gaze over the familiar Mindy's Hall before him. He finally revealed a haggard but relaxed smile. Welcome home. At that moment, the prince's heart surged with a warmth that originated from 6 years ago. The gloom of the past was swept away. It was like the estrangement when he first returned to Constellation. It was just a fleeting moment. It was not worth mentioning. Chapter 520. Gilbert coughed and quickly regained his composure. So, according to usual practice, as a prince who has yet to reach adulthood, you will have a professional teaching team to ensure that you will benefit from your lessons in grammar, etiquette, and more. 1 or 2 attendants, a certain number of personal protectors. Thales took a sip of tea and used it to tidy up his emotions. It sounds very familiar. Gilbert nodded. He seemed to be a little sentimental. Of course, 6 years ago, due to the urgency of the situation, everything was simplified. We were unable to provide you with the best and most suitable personnel. Later, the development of the situation disrupted our plans. When you were in the north, it was difficult for us to send you the manpower that Exted accepted. I am deeply sorry for this. Gilbert's words were filled with deep regret. Not entirely. Thales shook his head and subconsciously curled up his lips. As a teacher, Poutre might have disappeared for a few years and was unforgiving with his words, but he was indeed knowledgeable and had a unique way of thinking. He helped me along the way and taught me a lot. It was hard to imagine that the sinister little old man who smoked his pipe in the corner occasionally made you choke on your words and always jumped out when you least expected it. He was actually good friends with the dignified, courteous, thorough, and reliable Gilbert. He was even a classmate who was taught by a home tutor. As for the attendant, Wuxia was loyal, hardworking, and responsible over the past 6 years. He was a prince's attendant that was hard to come by. Thales keenly noticed that when Wuxia was mentioned, Gilbert's expression darkened again. The prince could not help but feel sentimental. 6 years ago, when he met Wuxia, he thought that he was a little rigid and stern, but now Thales discreetly glanced at the expressionless Star Lake guards around him. He sighed slightly in his heart. There were some things that one should not care about when one was blessed. Then there was the protector. Yes, Thales suddenly felt a headache coming on. As the prince's protector, he sighed and said awkwardly, very lively. As the prince narrated, Gilbert seemed to have sunk into his memories. His gaze moved slightly. Besides, Thales snapped out of his daze and said with a smile, "Didn't you invite Old Crow for me in the last year?" When this nickname was mentioned, Gilbert's expression brightened, and he beamed with joy. "And I hope Mr. Hicks can be of some help to you." "Phew, of course he does." Thales shrugged. He thought of that special teacher, the stubborn veteran in Shield District who was physically and mentally disabled, but had a strong will. He also thought of the bond between them and his mysterious mother. And the help he gave me, you can't imagine. There was a moment of silence in the living room. Neither of them spoke. During this time, the servants served tea and snacks under the company of the royal guards. "I promise you, Your Highness." Gilbert looked at Thales again. His tone was gentle. "Since you have returned to Eternal Star City and have been promoted to a duke, you should have received a noble and effective education. The knowledgeable people appointed by His Majesty, and I will do our best for your learning. We will start with setting up your daily schedule and planning your daily life." His daily routine. Thales could not help but scratch his head when he heard this. "In truth, I have been used to studying by myself for the past 6 years. You know, there's a huge library in Heroic Spirit Palace." But Gilbert shook his finger, as if he was prepared for this. Being forced to study by yourself behind closed doors due to limited conditions and having resources but not using them are two different things. Also, Gilbert changed the topic, and he became stern and serious. "If you know anything about learning, Your Highness, then you will know. Aside from memorizing things by rote and accumulating knowledge effortlessly, nothing can be learned by oneself." Thales stared at him in a daze. Gilbert raised his fingers and tried to persuade Thales earnestly with good intentions. "You need someone to guide you, discuss with you, ask for your advice, supervise you, stimulate you, encourage you, help you, and respond to your learning results. These are things that cold, hard books cannot give you." All right, I understand." Thales interrupted him, feeling a headache coming on. He gestured with his finger, as if he had given up on himself. "Learning, lessons, and all that. All right, come on. Forget it. Besides, it's just a lesson. Aside from ghosts and crabs, I have never been afraid of anything in my life. Gilbert nodded with a smile. Very well. That is why I want to discuss with you today and sort out your learning schedule from now on. Constellation's cunning fox raised his glasses again. At the same time, he picked up a pen with his right hand and wrote something on a piece of paper on his knees. Thales, who could not fight for a free life as a worm, stared at him in boredom. Then grammar, etiquette, history, military affairs. Gilbert narrowed his eyes and looked up. Among these four, what did you learn in Extet? Thales raised his head and thought. The days in Heroic Spirit Palace and Saroma's study room. Grammar, etiquette, history, military affairs. They did not categorize things this way, but let us skip grammar and etiquette first, Thales said, feeling a headache coming on. First, history. Thales tapped his fingers as he recalled. In the past 6 years, they changed many history teachers, from scholars, nobles to priests and priests of the temple. Count Leespan even personally taught them when he was free. Seal Leespan. I remember that Lord Dragon's eye. Gilbert's eyes focused. 18 years ago, during the peace talks at the fortress, he was a difficult opponent. When he remembered Regent Lispan's eyes, which seemed to be able to see through his thoughts, Thales nodded with lingering fear. Rather than calling it history, the Northlanders, especially the nobles, should be called traditional lesson. Gilbert's gaze flickered. Traditional? Thales nodded. From the ancient Northland countries, Takmu's alliance of 10,000 beasts, to the Iron Blood King's humans' last line of defense, the completion of the Temple of Knights, the kings working together to launch the Holiness Exorcism campaign. Then, the kings fighting against each other, the birth of the Pegasus, the award of honor and blood, the conquest of the empire. Then, the king of rebellion rebelled against the empire. The independence of Northland, the duel between the 6 kings. The eastward migration of the mountain elves. Then, the collapse of the empire in modern times. The orcs marching south during the moonless midwinter. The restoration of the last line of defense. The restoration of the 38th century grounds. Thales counted one by one. Gilbert also scribbled something down on a piece of paper. The Duke sighed. I'm just short of saying that the entire ancient empire was built because of the invincible Northland Knights, and then it was overthrown by them. In the end, we still have to rely on them to protect the human world. There was resignation in Thales' tone. But until Rikaru overturned Cold Wind and the 10 knights stood side by side next to it, if you listen to it more, you will realize the Duke's gaze gradually became serious. Rather than saying that they remember history, it would be more accurate to say that they want to remember the unique traditions of the Northland: survival, blood and iron, joint rule, duel, war, and glory. Gilbert thought deeply for a while before he continued. Or perhaps it is their laws and orthodoxy. Thales narrowed his eyes and nodded. Or to sum it up in one sentence: eat, sleep, fight orcs. The last one could be replaced with empire or constellation at any time. Who knows? It might be changed to Thales one day. The Duke of Star Lake swept away unnecessary thoughts and returned to the main topic. Then, it is Northland's etiquette class. Yes, you heard it right. The Northland nobles also have etiquette classes. How to meet, greet, get along with, and of course how to duel. Thales sighed. The Northland etiquette of insanity. The higher the status of the nobles, the more so. Etiquette, Gilbert pondered and mulled over the word. Regardless of the aspect, the more people who dislike the empire despise it, the more they look up to the former great empire, such as etiquette. Thales recalled some past events and sneered. Believe it or not, in a certain version of the story, Northland's tradition of dueling originated from a pair of brothers in ancient times. Legend has it that they fell in love with the same woman. Just like lions, in order to fight for the damned, right to mate in a pack. Thales pursed his lips. In fact, during his first year in Dragon Cloud City, Thales, who did not know the ropes, received friendly and eager duel requests from various extension nobles. Fortunately, his status was high enough, he was a prince, and fortunately, his backing was strong enough, the Archduchess, and even more so, he was thick-skinned enough. Thales lived through his first year in peace, and swore not to walk together with Saroma in public. She was the one who came to hold my hand first. Late at night, the 9-year-old Thales complained to his pillow, feeling wronged. Apart from that, they would also explain religion and beliefs during etiquette classes. Thales recalled, from the worship of ancestors in ancient times, to the belief in the mountains in modern times, to the Church of Holy Sun in modern times, to the bright moon and the setting sun today, to the throne and the great dragon after the Battle of Eradication, Northland's etiquette and beliefs are inseparable. Gilbert made a few notes, nodded, and said, "This is probably due to the influence of the Empire's legacy. A few hundred years ago, when the Church of Holy Sun was still the Empire's state religion, almost all the secretaries and scholars under the nobles of the Empire came from the Church's school. Almost every noble family had their own priests, and the belief in the Holy Sun was a compulsory lesson, second only to loyalty to the minister. In fact, religious etiquette and knight etiquette have quite a lot in common." Thales shrugged. He did not know whether he agreed or felt helpless. Aside from history and etiquette, there are also lessons on governance. As the name suggests, it teaches a suzerain's heir how to govern his territory. Of course, only noble families with counts and above would have such lessons. Thales recalled with a headache. It includes financial calculation, agriculture, business administration, human relations, etiquette, nobles' marriage relationships, and so on. There are many and complicated things. Gilbert seemed to be deep in thought. But do you know what's the most interesting thing? Thales exhaled. His tone was one of mockery and one of disdain. Under normal circumstances, women do not have the right to listen to this lesson. They are only prepared for male heirs. Of course, in the past few hundred years, Ekstedt had never produced a female heir who could be put on the table. That was why he had the honor of accompanying a certain someone to attend the lesson. Ironically, Thales was more capable than his female deskmate in stimulating the teacher's desire to guide him in this lesson. But in fact, the contents of a Northland governance lesson, whether it be the measurement of income and expenditure, the management of household affairs, the analysis of human relations, the arrangement of banquets, or the arrangement of marriages according to etiquette, especially the parts related to numbers and marriage alliances, are all managed by the mistress after marriage. This is especially so for some nobles who only know how to drink and hunt, but are not very good at arithmetic. Thales tilted his head and thought for a while. He thought of Nicholas. In fact, there are quite a lot of men like this in Northland. So, among the many lessons that the Archduchess and I have to attend, the inexplicable governance lesson is actually the one that the nobles in Dragoncloud City will not dispute the most. Because she is a girl, after all. She will have to learn these things after she gets married, but I am a man. It is useless for me to learn these things. The prince said in disdain. Gilbert smiled at him. During the chaotic era of multiple kings, wives and daughters were only the ties that connected families to families and cities to cities. They had no status to speak of. Only since the fall of the empire did intelligent women have their own stage. A good girl can become a good wife to her future husband, sharing the responsibilities of the man's shoulders instead of being a beauty in a portrait. From this, it can be seen that the advancement of the status of the noble ladies depends on the maturity of the external conditions and environment. Only when the chaos of war is gone, the granaries are full, production is restored, the rule is stable, the war horses are useless, the weapons are ownerless, the physical work is reduced, and there are more mental tasks, will the disadvantages of women's bodies be reduced, and their intellect can be put to use. Gilbert added another sentence with a seemingly profound meaning. If the world has not reached that day, then it will be futile for you to stand up for your schoolmates in Dragoncloud City. However, Thales' interest was piqued. So, if the external conditions are never ripe, such as production is not developed, the economy is backward, the political situation is unstable, and wars are frequent. If the world will never reach that day, such as people still relying on their physical strength and strength to work, then should women be subservient and continue living like this forever? Gilbert raised the spectacles in his hands. It is a pity, but this is an obvious and objective fact. We are powerless to do anything about it. Thales stared at him and suddenly smiled. Reality and ought to be. Gilbert was taken aback. What? You gave me his answer, Gilbert. The young Duke sighed. To answer my odd question, that is not right. Gilbert was stunned at first, then came to a realization. Looks like we can improve our grammar lessons a little. The Foreign Affairs Minister smiled gently, especially the logical part. Thales smiled to go along with him. But before we solve this age-old problem, let us return to the main topic. Gilbert wisely did not linger on this topic anymore. Then, aside from history, etiquette, and governance, Thales blew hard, but he did not manage to make sound. But this did not affect the complicated feelings he had towards the next answer. Lastly, and also the most distinctive part of the North, the Northlanders' military lessons. Chapter 521. When they talked about this topic, Gilbert's gaze became serious. You can't imagine how the Northlanders, especially the nobles who are above the rank of count, understand military lessons and how they arrange them. When he said this, Thales' expression became solemn as well. Military lessons are divided into two parts, outdoors and indoors. Thales' gaze was fixed on the air. The nobles' outdoor military lessons include personal martial arts, military leadership, and so on. They take up a huge proportion, and there are lessons almost every day. Thales spread his fingers. Getting beaten up, riding, charging, archery, hunting, patrolling the military camp, military drills. Of course, the Prince of Constellation usually does not have a part in the last few parts. Gilbert narrowed his eyes. Getting beaten up? Thales sighed and chased away the dead face in his mind. Don't mind these details. The Duke snapped out of his daze. As for the nobles' indoor military lessons, I was also shocked when I first saw them. Thales looked at the Foreign Affairs Minister and said sternly, "It's grammar, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy." Gilbert's pen stopped moving. Yes, you heard it right. Thales frowned. How to read, write, calculate, know the weather, calculate distance. These are all compressed by the extensions and placed in the indoor military lessons. Gilbert was silent for a while before he started writing. I have indeed heard that the Northlanders are used to learning how to read and write during the war lessons, but even the Arun family in Constellation, this is the first time I have heard someone who has personally experienced it so closely. Interesting. Thales curled up the corners of his lips and shrugged. As for why, according to a certain dead face, if you do not know how to read and write military orders, you will not be able to calculate the number of people, understand the terrain, and understand the weather and astronomy. Thales mockingly hooked two of his fingers. Then what's the point of fighting a war? Thales leaned back indignantly. Who could have imagined that the seemingly clumsy Nicholas could know how long it would be until daybreak, and when would be the best time to launch a surprise attack, just by looking up at the stars? Who could have imagined that the seemingly clumsy Nicholas would be able to calculate the slope of the ground in front of him and the preparations needed for the cavalry's charge with just a cursory glance? Who could have imagined that the current direction of the wind would affect the arrows fired by the crossbows just by looking up at the sky? Everyone in the team knows that Iceberg forced him to memorize everything, but he doesn't know the logic behind it at all. This was from a veteran white blade guard who talked about the past with the newbies in Heroic Spirit Palace. So, when you're scouting the wild, you can just ask the leader which direction is east. Don't be specific about which star is the supreme star, or why does the supreme star point to the east. Isaiah once impolitely asked that question. That day, they fought in front of Prince Soria. What? You're asking what happened next? After that, Iceberg came up with a good idea to mediate their conflict. They shook hands 50,000 times. That day, the entire White Blade Guards did nothing but stand in front of the palace gate as punishment. They watched the two of them shake hands again and again without any expression on their faces. They took turns counting from morning till night until they almost puked. When His Majesty found out, he simply moved the dining table out and watched them shake hands while eating. What's gratifying is that after that, they got along much better. At most, they would point at each other's noses and hurl harsh words at each other, but they never fought again. Look, this is the brotherhood under the oath of blades. Oh my God, I'm so touched and time flies. The touching story is over. Let's get down to business. Who were the bastards who dared to fight at their post today? And Nicholas was just a beginner. He wasn't even born into nobility. As for geometry and astronomy, even though most of the time they read back and forth between ancient books and mixed in with a lot of outdated calculations and ancient legends, coupled with the natural geography around Northland, Northlanders are few in number, the weather is cold, the desert is hot, plants are sparse, the stars are full of bad people, and the sea is full of big monsters. Thal's voice became heavy. But as long as it involves practical, experiential applications on the battlefield, these things that seem simple to us will become incredibly detailed and practical. Thal's expression was solemn. Reading and writing emphasize efficiency and directness, while arithmetic emphasizes convenience and speed. As for geometry and astronomy, for example, the calculation of the distance of a charge, the measurement of the slope and firing range, the statistics of the team, the estimation of the battle-loss ratio, the direction of the stars, the prediction of the weather, the observation of the terrain. When the Duke said this, he cast Gilbert a glance with complicated emotions. And there are even foreign languages and music in military classes. Gilbert looked up. Foreign languages? Music? Thales nodded. Do you know how to say child in the Orc language? The Northlanders know that Sereno and Serina are the Orc language of the desert and glaciers respectively, because they can be used when dealing with the bastards. Gilbert shuddered again. As for music, you know that there are many types of Northland's war drums and bone flutes, Thales said quietly. There are those that are crude and desolate, and there are also those that are filled with passion. They range from charging and fighting to the death, to retreating and withdrawing, from celebrating victory to sending off at funerals, and so on and so forth. This is the meaning behind the existence of Northland's music. The living room was quiet for a while. Everyone knows that Northland values soldiers and values martial arts. This time, it was Gilbert's turn to sigh. But it seems that their constant victories on the battlefield and their invincibility are not without reason. There's a historical tradition behind it. Let's not talk about other things for now. At the very least, an extant noble who has received a good education will definitely be a qualified commander on the battlefield, regardless of whether it is in terms of spirit, temperament, or ability. They are not illiterate, and neither are they idiots. Gilbert sighed with emotion. There was a great amount of wariness in his eyes. This is our destiny, a terrifying opponent. This topic was a little heavy. Thales could only nod with complicated emotions. So, Northland's historical traditions, Northland's etiquette and jurisprudence, and the knowledge of the Northland nobles' governance. Gilbert shook off his sentimentality. And their most unique military lessons. Are these what you learned in Northland? I can't say that I learned them. I just know them. Thales forced himself to smile. After all, they did not really treat me as a prince and taught me attentively. At least, they did not before the old crow. Gilbert nodded slightly. When he looked at Thales, there was a hint of pity in his eyes. The Foreign Affairs Minister flipped through many pages and took out another piece of paper that was filled with writing. Usually, the education of the nobles and constellation inherits the empire's tradition. It extends from the empire's 7 arts and forms a system of its own. It is very different from Northland. Gilbert cast a glance at Thales. But I will consider your experience in Northland's education, Your Highness. I will make some minor adjustments. The Duke could only smile. Gilbert also smiled and explained. Usually, the knowledge required by a qualified constellation noble is divided into 3 categories. 3 categories. Thales nodded in his heart. It's all right. Not much. The first category is the basic category. It is divided into 4 subjects: grammar, history, etiquette, ancient language, and foreign languages. Thales frowned slightly. There are 4 subjects in the first category? That's quite a lot. But grammar, history, etiquette, it's quite similar to Northland. Thales mumbled. Then Gilbert said his next sentence with a grin. As for grammar, the first subject, it is divided into 3 subjects. Thales instantly froze. What? Gilbert still had that smile on his face as he continued to speak. Grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Thales quickly stopped him. Wait, it sounds a little familiar. The prince did not comment on the total number of subjects, 3 times 4 times 3. Instead, he recalled another memory. Although it was only for a few months, Thales scratched his chin and pondered. But based on the situation in Northland, the old crow rearranged our curriculum. He rearranged my curriculum. Gilbert gestured for him to continue. Grammar is the subject that Northlanders look down on the most, Thales said tentatively. But the old crow did the exact opposite. He deliberately removed it from the indoors military lessons and emphasized that we need to learn 3 things in grammar. Gilbert smiled. Let me guess, he was referring to grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Thales nodded. Yes, but it's not that detailed. Northlanders don't like it. Usually, the old crow will give us a poem or a short essay. He will ask us to study its grammar, explain the author's thoughts clearly, and summarize its logical structure. Then, he will ask us to rewrite it rhetorically. Gilbert seemed to have remembered something. He nodded with a nostalgic expression. Dragon Kiss Academy has a long history, and Dragon Kiss Land is rarely affected by the flames of war. Over the centuries, it has been a place where the Western Peninsula's people gather. Their culture is deeply influenced by the Empire, and they retain a lot of the Empire's civilization. To a certain extent, they're even more so than us. He nodded in approval and gratification. Thank you, Mr. Hicks. You saved us a lot of trouble. But this time, it was Thales' turn to frown. So, the so-called tradition of the Empire has to be learned in such detail in a grammar class in Constellation? There are 3 main categories. The first category has 4 subjects, and the first subject has 3 subjects, so 3 times 4, and then 3 times, no way. He thought of something, and his expression darkened. Gilbert laughed. You may not have noticed, Your Highness, but 6 years ago, what I taught you here was the component parts of the grammar class. The grammar understanding of the ancient language of the Empire and ancient poetry, and the logic and rhetoric of sonnets. Thales came to a sudden realization. But since you said so, I will make changes according to my discretion during grammar class. Mr. Hicks handled it very appropriately. Gilbert lifted his glasses again, lowered his head, and marked the first row of the schedule on the paper. Then, let us set aside 6 mornings every week for grammar class. Thales' expression changed. Wait a minute. 6 days? The prince's expression turned bitter. Since we are pressed for time, can't we set it aside for history and etiquette classes? Grammar is not something that can be learned in a short period of time. But Gilbert was very insistent on it. The importance of grammar class far surpasses your imagination, Your Highness. The Foreign Affairs Minister continued to scribble the schedule on the paper. Listening and speaking are not difficult. But what is difficult is that aside from listening, not everyone knows how to think, understand, and express. Gilbert looked up. What's worse is that everyone thinks they know how to do it. The cunning fox narrowed his eyes. That is why Mr. Hicks has a saying, most of the conflicts in this world are because some people fail grammar class. This is why aside from listening and speaking, we also need to read and write. This is not as simple as learning how to read. Thales was speechless. All right. Gilbert lowered his head to organize his schedule. You were born noble, Your Highness, but if you cannot even fully understand the words spoken by others, if you cannot even see the logic behind the words, and if you do not even know about the rhetoric that contains reason, Gilbert snorted softly. Then it is extremely irresponsible of me to rashly let you understand history, learn etiquette, and push you to the whole world. The more Gilbert spoke, the more excited he became. If you do not know grammar, do not know logic, and do not know rhetoric, or even worse, if you know all 3 but do not know how to use them and do not benefit from them, then when you face history, etiquette, and different people, things, the choices you can make based on your intelligence will be very limited. You will either follow them blindly on impulse, or you will oppose them with ignorance, or you will imitate them clumsily, or you will regard them with disdain. And all of them can be categorized into one category, misunderstanding. It will turn you into an arrogant idiot. Thales raised an eyebrow. I'm just asking a question. Why do I feel like I'm being taught a lesson? And Thales could not help but think. At this moment, Gilbert is really like the old crow himself. Gilbert continued to speak. On the contrary, if you are well-versed in grammar, Then you will be able to learn history, etiquette, and the ways of the world with half the effort. You will be able to understand them with just 1 point. You will not be like most people who only rely on intuition and luck to live in their own world in a muddle-headed manner. Gilbert changed the topic, and his expression became warm. Please remember, Your Highness, this is not for the moment, but for the long term. Thales felt a headache coming on from his words, and he could not help but lean back. All right. Everything you said is right. Everything is right. So the grammar class is set. Then, in the basic class, there's only history, etiquette, ancient language, and foreign languages left. Gilbert paused for a moment before he put down his glasses. I believe that Old Crow, Mr. Hicks, has also made corresponding adjustments. History, etiquette, ancient language, and foreign languages. Thales sighed. Yes, his first class is history. But his history is not just the traditional fables of the Northlanders. He only tells you what happened, and what you need to remember, what lessons you learn, who is right and who is wrong, and who has the greatest contributions in the history that you need to remember the most, and other flattering words. As Thales spoke, he was gradually reminded of the past. On the contrary, every part of history that the Old Crow explains will lead to a theme. Then, you will stop there and come back to force you to think. The more he spoke, the more engrossed he became. The formation of laws, the foundation of beliefs, the boundaries of governance, the meaning of victory and defeat. All these things that you cannot see or think of when you only read narratives, only read heroic hymns, and only read predetermined conclusions. Perhaps it was out of respect for his teacher, or perhaps it was because he had spoken too much just now. But this time, Gilbert did not say anything else. Very well, then we will have 3 history lessons a week for 3 nights. We only need to adjust the main points of history. Why don't we start from the 208 emperors of the empire and the 39 kings of Constellation? Gilbert happily ticked off 3 boxes on the schedule. Wait, how many? Thales' face instantly darkened. Indeed, he had read about the deeds of many emperors of the empire, but 208? As he looked at Gilbert's smiling expression, Thales exhaled weakly. The etiquette class is taught by Gings. Count Leespan will also appear when he is free. It is said that he often invites some highly respected old nobles and noblewomen. Thales said listlessly, Originally, I often skipped these classes and went out to read and study by myself. At the same time, I would avoid being noticed and test Heroic Spirit Palace's loopholes. I would fight against the Star Killer with my wits and courage. But after the Old Crow came, he told us that although it was boring, etiquette classes were not just about etiquette. At least, it was not just about teaching you how to greet others, nod, and bow. Thales' spirits were lifted. This includes ethics, morals, rules of nobility, and religious traditions. It is the true Northland way. From this point of view, even the etiquette classes of Northlanders are not boring anymore, because it reflects the things that Northlanders value. They tell you that as a Northland suzerain, when you want to kill, when you can be pardoned, when you have to fight, and when you need peace. So, in his eyes, etiquette is not just about etiquette. It is something that has been established and is self-evident. It is the old and new laws of Ekstedt, the rules of the nobles, the responsibilities and obligations of the suzerains, and the rights and freedom of the vassals. For example, Thales' eyes focused. Raikaru's joint ruling pledge. What it reflected was not only the cold and inflexible book of rules, but also the warm and lively actors. It's true politics. It was like Thales' vision suddenly became blurry. Garfinkel's so-called explanation and index, these so-called elements of tacit understanding that goes without saying, build a bridge between action and scene, allowing people and the environment to reflect each other and build together, such as the public etiquette that everyone must abide by. Thales shook his head desperately, throwing this memory that was too far away from this world and too profound to his brain. After returning from Western Desert, for some reason, the memories of the past 6 years that had gradually quietened down began to surge up from time to time, like a volcano that had accumulated pressure. It was like the return of a tide. Thales pressed against his forehead. While dispelling the dizziness from earlier, he was also puzzled. It's like this after returning to Constellation. Is it a coincidence? Frowny face bookmark for easier reading. Chapter 5:22. Very well, I will remember. There is no harm in being flexible in etiquette lessons. We will still have 3 nights a week, but when it comes to practical use, we can do it anytime and anywhere. Mobile phones. Gilbert's words rang beside his ears, and they pulled him back to reality. Fales tried his best not to look at the schedule on Gilbert's knees. He also tried his best not to calculate how much free time he had left in a week. He sucked in a deep breath. As for the ancient language and foreign languages you mentioned, the prince nodded. Yes, the language of the ancient empire. The Northlanders despise this stuff, but the old crow insisted on putting it back in the curriculum. Fale's eyes lit up. Don't waste the ancient books in the library. That's what he said. Gilbert moved a little. He was a little nostalgic and also a little touched. Is that so, Mr. Hicks? Fale snorted and smiled. He intended to lighten the burden of this class. Of course, with your foundation and years of conscious reading, the language of the ancient empire is still quite easy for me. As for my classmate, Fale shrugged. I'm afraid she doesn't think so. When he recalled how Saroma was staring blankly at a book titled Poems of Political Satire from the Era of Kings and City-States, written in the ancient language of the ancient empire, biting her nails and looking around. Occasionally, she would cast a terrified glance at him as he flipped through the pages quickly. Fales instantly felt incredibly happy. He decided that he would never tell her the secret to fast reading. Can't understand? Then I'll skip it. At this moment, Gilbert suddenly spoke. So, Mr. Hicks, are you teaching the language of the ancient empire or the modern language of the empire? Fales was stunned and hesitated. Let me think. However, Gilbert nodded without hesitation and began to write in rustling sound again. I understand. You will need additional guidance for both languages of the empire. 2 languages. Fales suddenly felt a sense of sorrow, as if he had shot himself in the foot. The Foreign Affairs Minister looked up. And foreign languages? The prince looked at the increasingly fewer empty spaces on the schedule. He said with a bitter expression, does the Orc language count? Gilbert raised his eyebrows. With a look of understanding, he lowered his head and wrote, filling up the few remaining empty spaces. So you still need guidance for 3 languages. Ancient CIA, Ancient Reen, and the common language of the elves. Fales lifted his head in fear. I was just joking, Your Highness. Gilbert raised his head and laughed loudly. Except for the elves themselves and linguists, no one can speak the first 2 languages. Don't worry, you only need to learn the common elven language. As he watched her cross out a few more boxes, Fales wisely swallowed the question. So, does Ida know how to speak? Very good. Then, grammar, history, etiquette, and language will be done with the basic classes in your curriculum, Gilbert said in satisfaction. Next is the second category. What? There's more? Fales felt another wave of heartache. The first category was enough to make him suffer. However, Gilbert's next sentence attracted his attention. Philosophy. At that moment, Fales was stunned again. A few seconds later, Fales could no longer care about the pressure from his studies. What? Gilbert raised his head seriously and enunciated each word clearly. Philosophy is an ancient name. It's an extremely broad subject. Today, especially in your curriculum, it includes mathematics, nature, art, and theology. What? Mathematics, nature, art, and theology? Fales asked in surprise. All of these can be placed in philosophy? Gilbert smiled faintly and retorted with the same sentence. Which of them can't be placed in philosophy? Fales waved his hand. I know what you mean. The Duke was a little puzzled. But I thought that philosophy, which has a narrow and specialized meaning, is not so specific. Isn't it supposed to answer some broad and profound ultimate questions? The Foreign Affairs Minister seemed to be joking with him as he repeated the same words. Then, what questions do you think are not part of the broad and profound ultimate questions? Fales was stunned. He then scratched his head. God, I must have gotten this from Cohen. What are we eating today? He asked in a daze. Gilbert put down his glasses, sucked in a breath, and sat up straight. First of all, the question of what are we eating can also be very profound. He looked at the prince earnestly and earnestly. Secondly, Your Highness, as long as a scribe or civil official who graduated from an academy works hard enough and is familiar with ancient books, he or she can also become well-versed in grammar, history, etiquette, and language. As long as a conscript or a commoner knight who came from a city defense team works hard enough and practices martial arts, he or she can also be outstanding in martial arts, common command, invincible on the battlefield, and make many contributions. All of them have the chance to be conferred the title of nobility one day. Gilbert's gaze sharpened. But how do you differentiate between the fact that you are a true noble with a long history and extraordinary significance, and the fact that they are not? Thales gave him an awkward smile in return. I don't really know. After all, it's my first time as well, being a noble after all. Fortunately, he tried his best to suppress the words that he had been ridiculed countless times, glittering golden blood into his throat. Gilbert smiled mysteriously. If you're not used to it, Your Highness, then just treat it as a nice name, philosophy. Gilbert looked outside the window, and there was a yearning look in his eyes. You must know that long before the age of the Empire, philosophy encompassed everything. It was once known as the study of all laws, and it was a compulsory course for the nobles. At that time, the knights controlled their armies on horseback and talked about philosophy when they dismounted. As a noble, it did not matter whether they learned philosophy or not. Study of all laws? Compared to the seat of all laws that Asda mentioned, Thales paid attention to it quietly. But the content it contains, mathematics, nature, art, and theology, seems to be a little. The prince struggled to find an adjective, but he failed in the end. Gilbert only looked at him from afar with a smile on his lips. He did not answer. Thales, who could not find the right words, could only exhale. You remind me of the old crow again. The Duke of Star Lake recalled the past. Arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and geography. Even though the education of the nobles in Northland included them in military lessons without thinking, the old crow separated them and explained each of the 4 subjects separately. And the old crow did not just talk about simple arithmetic, but Gilbert suddenly took over the conversation. Algebra. Thales' eyes lit up. Did he teach you that too? Gilbert chuckled. This is a compulsory course in Dragon Kiss Academy. It can be considered as an old tradition from a long time ago. Teacher Hicks brought some of it to his home class. The Foreign Affairs Minister said airily, at the very least, all the students in Dragon Kiss Academy must learn how to solve general algebra, such as the principles and formulas of a quartic equation. What? Quartic equation? And it's a compulsory course? Thales laughed dryly. Why? Why not just learn the quintic equation, the sixfold equation, and the sevenfold equation? What he did not expect was that Gilbert began to recall in an exceptionally serious manner. Mr. Hicks said that no one has found a way to solve the quintic equation. It is said that there were some methods during the age of the Empire. Some people found them, but they were lost after the Battle of Eradication. It is said that some scholars who have devoted their entire lives to research even more deeply. Their algebra is no longer limited to referring to simple numbers, but to some objects beyond reality and beyond imagination. They can even find ways to accurately refer to direction and space, as well as motion and change. For this reason, their arithmetic paper can be spread out on several floors. Gilbert, you can stop here. Thales started to feel a headache coming on. He made a gesture to stop Gilbert. In the Northlanders' indoor military classes, I personally prefer astronomy and geography, even though my classmates prefer it the other way around. Sorry, my interest in mathematics can't compare to a little girl in Northland. Thales thought in a half-mocking and half-resigned manner. You really bring shame to the traditions of the Empire. Gilbert lowered his head and continued to fill in the blanks. Apart from mathematics, geography broadens one's knowledge and broadens one's horizons. Art includes music, painting, sculpture, dance, poetry, and drama. It cultivates one's body and mind, and cultivates one's temperament. As for theology, it is more abstruse. You will come to know about it. The weekly schedule required for them to be added together. Let me see. Thales became more and more tired as he listened. Gilbert furrowed his eyebrows and picked up the draft of the schedule. Oh, it seems like the schedule can't fit all of them. It's all right. I will go back and arrange the proportion of basic courses and philosophy courses so that they can be mixed together. Thales closed his eyes, resigned to his bad luck. But he remembered something. He immediately opened his eyes and asked, "Wait a minute, Gilbert. Didn't you just say that there are 3 main categories?" Gilbert looked at him and revealed an expression that said that Thales was worth teaching. "Yes, the 3rd main category is practical. I will have to report this to His Majesty to make a decision." "What else?" Thales asked, not without sorrow. "Practical." Gilbert cleared his throat and continued to write notes on the piece of paper that predicted Thales' future fate. Let me give you an example. Practical governing. This is especially needed by the big families with the title of Count and above. Military command and logistics, reporting and handling of government affairs, agriculture and business, finance and taxation, national politics and diplomacy, religion and relations between nobles, law, and jurisprudence. But this is not something that can be taught by a normal teacher in an academy. Usually, it needs to be combined with reality and examples. It would be best if the students can personally experience it. After Gilbert finished writing something down, he raised his head, narrowed his eyes, and smiled. "You do not have to be anxious for now. Fill up the content at the beginning first." He looked at the schedule in his hands excitedly. Then grammar, logic, and rhetoric in grammar class. Then history class and etiquette class. I need to make some slight adjustments to the focus of these classes. 2 types of the ancient language of the empire and the common language of the elves. I reckon that you have almost forgotten the basics of the latter. Then there's mathematics, nature, art, and theology. The rest of these 4 classes will be further subdivided according to your interests and the teachers you can find. For example, I recommend art. As for the specific choice of tutors, let me take a look. It will be best if I can find a different tutor for each class, so that you will feel a sense of novelty and like to attend classes. I will have to make a separate note for practical classes as he listened to his words. Thales' expression changed from fear, pain, and sorrow in the beginning to gradually becoming numb. "Very good. These are the 3 classes for you." Gilbert smiled so widely that his teeth were exposed. "I wish you a pleasant study." Thales glanced at the schedule that was almost filled to the brim, and his face instantly turned pale. "Do you think that I can handle all of them?" Gilbert shook his finger. He was full of confidence. No. Others may not know, but 6 years ago, I personally witnessed your learning progress. Your Highness, you could be called a genius." Wait. Thales' lips twitched. "I believe that these classes will be a piece of cake for you. Besides, 6 years ago, when you were still young, didn't you tell me this?" Gilbert blinked. He was filled with the gratification of finding a good student. "You love to attend classes the most." Thales' vision darkened. "Gilbert, did you misunderstand something?" If he said that his brain was damaged by the Northlanders, would it be of any use? But the Foreign Affairs Minister obviously did not understand his feelings. "Then, I will take my leave first. I will come again tomorrow. You must be ready for your grammar class." Thales could no longer remember how he sent Gilbert away. He only remembered nodding and smiling in a daze, then nodding with a smile. When Thales came back to his senses, he was already standing at the door of the reception room. At this moment, a voice that was no longer unfamiliar rose from behind him. "Is it over?" Thales turned around in a daze. "Very good. The police station just sent someone over to chase away the uninvited guests who wanted to visit the Duke." The captain of his personal guards, Watchman Lord Mallows, was still smiling nonchalantly. "Then, you should have time, right?" Thales looked at him numbly. He did not understand. Mallows grinned, and those who saw him felt as if they were bathed in the spring breeze. "Get ready, Your Highness. Our training will begin tomorrow." "Oh." Thales also returned to his senses in a daze. "Wait. F***ck." Thales snapped out of his numbness. He turned around abruptly, and his eyes widened. F***ck what? Mallows frowned a little. "Did Count Casso not tell you?" Thales shook his head subconsciously. The watchman walked forward and sized up the Duke with narrowed eyes. Other than the complicated classes on the basics, philosophy, and practical matters, there is one more important thing for the nobles of Constellation. One more important thing? Mallows nodded and said with a smile, "Since the Age of Kings, it has been the most crucial standard to prove the difference between nobles and commoners." Again, an ominous premonition rose in Thales' heart. He heard Mallows say with a smile, "Martial arts." Thales did not react and was momentarily speechless. 3 seconds later, the prince took a deep breath. "No, I'll learn martial arts." What does that have to do with you?" Mallows interrupted him with his standard etiquette. "Unfortunately, I am Tormund Mallows. I have just been appointed by His Majesty to be your martial arts instructor." Thales was stunned. Mallows looked up with a beaming smile. "So, for 7 days a week, I need you to devote 7 mornings and 7 afternoons. Starting tomorrow, please move to the training field in the backyard punctually at 6 in the morning and 5 in the afternoon. Follow me and train well." He said the last few words with great delight. Thales stared at him blankly, unable to say a word. Mallows patted his shoulder and flashed a friendly smile. "Don't be hasty, Your Highness. We still have a long way to go." Thales sucked in a breath and walked forward numbly, completely ignoring the amused gazes behind him. But Mallows stopped him. "Your Highness, you may train moderately, but swords are blind." His smile was gentle and magnanimous, but in Thales' eyes, it looked extremely evil. "If you bump into anything, please bear with me." Mallows bowed appropriately, smiled, and turned to leave. The prince was left alone in the morning light. At this moment, Thales felt complicated. His mind was gloomy. After a long while, he walked out of the guest hall with a haggard face. He was ready to enjoy his life as a parasite for the last time. The prince suddenly understood. "So, when I was in Northland, it was just this world's 9 years of compulsory education." Thales exhaled in pain. "Now, I'm finally 14 years old. I should," Thales thought in despair. High school. Watching the Duke walk past with a numb expression, Doyle shook his head in the distance. Unfortunately, this child came when Mallows was being threatened by a fat noble and was in a bad mood. But Doyle sized up Thales' despondent look. "Oh, our second prince, the Duke of Star Lake, can't take it anymore?" His eyes darted around, and he scratched his chin. After all, the female officials in the palace, they're still waiting to give him a lesson on gender. Royal bloodline, royal bloodline. Chapter 5:23. In Eternal Star City, the excitement caused by the prince's return had subsided, or perhaps it was just being suppressed, waiting for the next outbreak. At least Mindy's Hall, which was closed to all visitors, was no longer as crowded as before. Thales enjoyed a rare period of peace and quiet, but this did not mean that he was at ease from then on. From the second day onwards, before Prince Thales could properly enjoy the power that came with the great identity of Master of Mindy's Hall, the Royal Teaching Group, led by Gilbert, Royal Fresh Meat Packaging Company, the Duke's indignant words, entered Mindy's Hall in an orderly manner. First of all, the instructor for grammar classes, which included the language of the ancient empire and the common language of the elves, was the renowned Grand Scholar Bonner from Wong Liwen Law School. To be able to hire him, one could not help but say that he was a good and cheap teacher. On one hand, Grand Scholar Bonner's bald head, which was so smooth that it could reflect light, saved a lot of lamp oil in Mindy's Hall and conserved resources. On the other hand, his soft, deep, and intermittent voice, "I'm dying of illness," the mean DD, who could never speak loudly again, forced the entire Mindy's Hall to maintain absolute silence during class hours, benefiting the environment. Third, his profound knowledge and wide range of fields almost compressed the prince's 5 subjects: grammar, logic, rhetoric, the language of the ancient empire, and the language of the elves, into one, allowing Thales to understand the answers to the following questions. How much would the language, which even has a completely different word order from the common language, such as the troublesome language of the ancient empire and the damned common language of the elves, bring about changes to grammar? How would it affect the principles and expressions of logic? What kind of challenges would it bring to rhetoric? How would they affect the current language and way of speaking? How would they change people's habits of thinking? In the end, how would they cruelly and mercilessly nibble away at Prince Thal's precious sleep time? Your Highness, why you can't recite at all? He then sleep a little later. Anyway, you young people are lying when you say that you sleep early. You do everything but sleep in bed. What? It's not good for your hair. Oh, that's not important. Your Highness, do you know about wigs? Who in the palace doesn't wear wigs and fake breasts? What? You won't grow taller if you sleep late. Hey, Your Highness, won't you be tall enough if you wear the crown? The trembling scholar Bonner, whose words caused the prince's face to change color 3 times. Gilbert personally took charge of the history lesson. Compared to Scholar Bonner's extensive quotations and farsightedness, the Foreign Affairs Minister's goal was simple and clear: to turn Prince Thales into a humanoid version of From the Ancient Empire to Constellation. 2,000 years of general history encyclopedia. Index. Your Highness, I must correct your joke. It's just an index of the encyclopedia. It's enough to scare. Ahem, it's enough to show your erudition. The stern Gilbert. As for mathematics, it was perhaps one of the few subjects that could bring comfort to the Duke of Star Lake. Scholar Julio was rather surprised by Thal's level in geometry and algebra, especially when the prince had wasted 6 years in the godforsaken extet. But what gave Thales a headache was that, as Julio's confidence in him grew higher and higher, in order to teach an unprecedented prince of mathematicians after you're crowned, you must remember to allocate funds for us. Look, oh my, these naughty little formulas are so beautiful and cute. Don't they look like they're smiling at you? Scholar Julio, who kept waving his orchid fingers. The excited former was enthusiastically and rapidly expanding their course syllabus. For example, one day, Scholar Julio finally combined algebra and geometry and began to plan for Thales to use algebraic equations to calculate the trajectories and changes of celestial bodies. These basic equations don't match up, do they? The movement of the highest star is too strange. And, is it possible for us to grasp these immeasurable movements? A few scholars from Dragon Kiss Academy imagined that as long as we divide this movement process into different parts, and then continue to divide it, we will be able to get the answer. Let me show you the calculation formulas they came up with. Hey, Your Highness? What's wrong with you, Your Highness? Wake up, Your Highness. You should finish the questions first before you faint. Scholar Julio, who was young and promising but had turned pale, and the course materials they used had already expanded from the mathematical problems in ancient books to the actual figures of the people's lives. There were even a few times when Julio suggested that they might as well try to estimate the future annual income based on the country's previous annual income, or estimate the figures of all of Constellation based on the population growth in the Central Territory. Thales had reason to suspect that if he did not behave stupidly and slow down the course, it would only be a matter of time before a terrifying bell-shaped curve and a series of concepts appeared in his books. As for the nature course, thankfully, when the knowledgeable Lord Monton talked about astronomy, geography, culture, and customs, he was often humorous and captivating, if the prince did not often interrupt him and embarrass him. Why is the highest star in the east? What are the components of crystal drop ores? If we kill all the whales one day, we won't have any more eternal oil to use, right? Are werewolves and vampires really cursed monsters? Are they related to wolves and bats? Dragon Kiss Land is a basin, so isn't its climate a little strange? Are the fog and whirlpools over the twin mist seas really formed naturally? There were so many witnesses to the legend of the sea monsters in the Devil's Sea. Has no one ever doubted it? Why can the beliefs of sunset and bright moon coexist with their temples and churches? Man-eating flowers are like great dragons. How do they deal with their energy consumption? Is the capital of triumph and the homeland of the empire really under the eye of the sea of eradication? How do the Blood Clansmen in Grand Banquet Hill rule? There must be different terrains and climates in the Great Desert, right? Is the desert city Caligari real? Why didn't the mighty force that created the Great Crack and sink form a whirlpool and suck in the 2 continents? Where did the plague in the 3 kingdoms of the Mystery Sea start? Why is the interval between the 2 eruptions of Samra volcano so short? Is it because of the direction of the ocean current that the speed to reach the eastern peninsula from different ports is different? The prince's 100,000 whys. As for the art class, after seeing and listening to the paintings meticulously prepared by the Duke of Star Lake and a lute performance, the prestigious Master Yurin gently told Thales, "Actually, you don't have to be a creative artist to learn art. You can also be an art appreciator." I think the Duke is very suitable to be an art appreciator who will leave his name in history. Very, very suitable. In short, this week of the Prince's Refresher course made Thales miss his former life in Heroic Spirit Palace even more, except for the dead face. Why? Why didn't I kidnap little rascal and bring him to class in the first place? Thales, who felt like his body was being hollowed out every day, silently wept as he thought. It would have been better for him to go back to the desert. At least the orcs would not force him to memorize the 7 types of words, 3 parts of speech for tenses, 3 voices for pronouns, 5 word orders, and 18 different sentence patterns that could be changed according to the situation, including the complicated rules of pronunciation. In comparison, the language of the modern empire of that nuisance of a general in the black track was too simple. Or the 22 variations of the common pronunciation and intonation of the elven language. God, that was practically a vocal music class. In Mindy's hall, the pressure Thales felt was so great that he even forgot about the banquet 2 months later, not to mention the power whirlpool in Renaissance Palace. Even some of the special classes that were supposed to be slightly easier were the same. Like now. Do you feel it, Prince Thales? As your weapon, it is so firm, straight, and tough, yet it does not lose its tenacity and elasticity. The gentle and easygoing voice rose from his left ear and slowly circled to his right ear, making him itch. But is also so impulsive, wild, and has endless desires. It cannot be held back, longing to release itself, to behave atrociously, to conquer. But you cannot easily obey it. You must control it and not let this wild horse out of its cage easily. Thales' cheeks were red, and his breathing was rapid. He had no time to pay attention to the voice beside his ear. Exert strength in your waist. Hold it steady with your hands. Yes, that's it. Maintain this posture and direction. Try to straighten it. Do not tremble. Sweat flowed down Thales' cheeks. He suddenly trembled. Oh no. The voice became stern. I know this is difficult, but you must persevere. Straighten it. Straighten it. Raise it higher. Don't let it fall. But Thales could feel that he was already no. An uncontrollable numbness spread throughout his body. Oh no, oh no. I can't persevere anymore. Thales felt dizzy. He was about to. Finally, with a dull thud, the practiced sword in Thales' hands fell onto the sand along with the weight while hanging on the blade. The Duke of Star Lake breathed rapidly. His arm was sore and numb, and his gloves were drenched in sweat. Footsteps rose. Mallows walked up from behind him and stared at the sword on the ground with a contemplative look. The time is a little short. Thales swung his sore arm in frustration. He stomped his feet on the training ground that was temporarily emptied in the courtyard to soothe the numbness. It's fine, the prince said resentfully. I'm just not used to it. Northlanders don't teach like this. They tend to train against each other. Mallows snorted softly. Then perhaps you should go back to Northland? Thales was instantly rendered speechless. The setting sun shone on the courtyard of Mindy's hall, elongating Mallows and Thales' shadows on the ground. Behind them, Doyle stood under a pillar and said something to Glover beside him. Obviously, our prince has not gone through systematic training. Doyle shook his head. Looks like the Northlanders who are good at fighting are limited in their abilities. Glover pursed his lips. That's right. At that moment, Thales was listlessly attending the martial arts lesson personally taught by Lord Mallows. Obviously, after an entire day of torturing his brain, the Duke was not very interested in his personal guard captain's lesson of standing and stance. But Mallows seemed to be enjoying it. Sword forms and sword stances are important parts of ancient knight training. The watchman still had that polite smile on his face. He was not troubled by the prince's failure and attitude at all, especially the 17 knight swords. This is a classical and orthodox knight technique. It has been passed down in the palace since the empire. After Constellation was founded, it went through the careful research of countless masters, and it became what it is today. Under the gaze of a few royal guards who sparred with him, Mallows walked into the field and elegantly picked up the prince's metal practice sword. He hesitated for a moment and did not pick up the weight-bearing wheel as well. Every movement and posture has been carefully considered and verified countless times. Mallows turned the sword around and handed it over. He was gentle and elegant, and there was not a hint of impatience. And you need to pay full attention to it, carry it through to the end, and execute it to the extreme. Let it be deeply embedded in your body and become instinctive. Thales, whose mind was still filled with word order, cases, and arithmetic formulas, sighed and took the sword that Mallows handed over. But when Thales pulled, the long sword did not move at all. Thales was shocked and snapped out of his listless state. He raised his head and found that the sword was held firmly in Mallows' palm. He did not let go, so that at any moment during the battle, you can return to the most familiar and safest posture. Mallows stared at him deeply and started to become serious. For example, every time you attack, no matter what the outcome of the battle is, you must instinctively and quickly return to defend and remain alert. In the next second, Mallows suddenly let go. Thales swayed a little due to inertia before he stood firm. In the face of this rather unfriendly reminder, Thales forced a smile and swung the sword in a familiar manner. Even when the enemy is dead, Mallows' gaze turned cold. Even when the enemy is dead. Thales was shocked. Mallows continued, I guess the Northlanders did not teach you about the rear attack. Even if you cut off your opponent's head, his body will still retain inertia, and he can completely continue to complete the move he made before he died, such as cutting off your head. Thales paused for a moment. In fact, the Northlanders did. The young Duke turned his eyes and noticed that Doyle and Glover were watching from afar. Doyle even yawned rudely. But, you know what they have to face is the orcs' near-death counterattack. Thales shrugged. He decided to make a bet on this topic and quickly complete his portion for the day. If they let that kind of counterattack come out, regardless of whether they block it or not, and whether they block it with a strong or weak sword, it is basically a matter of time. There is not much meaning in returning to defend. So they emphasize on offense as defense, and they advocate suppressing the situation and pursuing the enemy while they are victorious. They believe that the most perfect battle is to make the opponent unable to fight back from the beginning until the end. Thales shook his head. Nicholas the Star Killer, Tolja the Fire Knight, Monty the Raven of Death. Among the Northland elites he met, there did not seem to be many who were particularly good at defense. On the contrary, in Constellation, from the Fortress Flower to the legendary Wing, and even a Knight of Judgment in the Prison of Bones, as for the Kingdom's Wrath. All right, that was an unusual existence that even the Northlanders were wary of. But Mallows looked at him with a profound gaze. He then took 2 steps forward, pressed down on Thales' shoulder, and moved closer to his ear. Then you better remember that your life is much more valuable than most people's. What you need to do is to survive, Your Highness, and not to die a moment later than your opponent. Survive. Mallows' tone was wary and mysterious. He sounded a little like a ghost story, and it made Thales shudder subconsciously. Also, most of the opponents you will meet in the future, if there are any, will be humans. Mallows let go of Thales' shoulder expressionlessly. When you face their attack from behind, it is very important to be able to return to defense in time and intelligently. Mallows' smile had long since disappeared. After all, what you learned is sword fighting, not suicide fighting. Thales frowned. He could sense Mallows' displeasure. It seems that my carelessness just now has offended him. Mallows walked out of the arena and said coldly, Return to the posture you were in when you received the sword and put on the weights. Try to persevere for another half an hour and let your body get used to it. Half an hour? Thales' face instantly turned sour. He had only experienced 12 hours of training since 6 in the morning. Does he still want to eat dinner? Mallows did not even turn his head around. I know that this process is very boring, empty, and tiring. There is no opponent, and there is no goal. Only you. The watchman's words contained a hint of coldness. There is only loneliness, desolation, forbearance, perseverance, and no helpers or enemies. Thales exhaled. In truth, your greatest enemy is living in your own will. Mallows turned around abruptly. His tone was incredibly firm. Kill it. Take back your will. Thales could not help but raise his eyebrows again. Really? Why did the lines in this training session sound so much like an inspirational story? But even though he criticized in his heart, Thales could only do as he was told. He pulled out the standard knight's posture for receiving the sword and tried his best to make his body meet the requirements. It's just that my mind is a little adrift. Thales thought in resignation. Soon, in less than 10 minutes, it should be almost time, right? After Thales, who was drenched in sweat and looking forward to it, the tip of his sword began to tremble. His movements gradually changed, and he could not quite bear it anymore. Muscle strength had never been Thales' forte. But this time, Thales secretly called out to his most familiar comrade. Soon, that habitual fluctuation came to him in a hidden and obedient manner. It spread to his right arm, soothed the soreness and burden in his muscles, and endlessly injected new energy into it. Thales gritted his teeth and exhaled. Not bad. I feel much better. The trembling at the tip of his sword also slowly subsided. He tried to stretch his body and return to the most standard knight's posture for receiving the sword. Outside the field, Mallow's eyes lit up as he observed attentively. He started to nod. Even Glover and Doyle's attention was drawn to him. Wow, I underestimated him just now. Doyle scratched his head. The Northlanders do have some skills. Even though he did not use Hell's senses, he had more or less enhanced his hearing, and he delivered these words into Thales' ears faithfully. The prince's lips curled up. Not bad. Mallows walked into the field with great interest. Not bad, Your Highness. In fact, it far exceeded my expectations. Thales could not help but straighten the line from his arm to the tip of his sword. Then, Mallows nodded in understanding and smiled mysteriously. It's really not bad. The watchman's gaze swept past Thales' steady arm and standard posture. In his most gentle and elegant tone, he gasped in admiration. Where's the power of eradication? At that moment, Thales, who had been focusing all his attention on maintaining his sword posture, was shocked. What did he say? The tip of his sword trembled slightly. On the other side, Glover and Doyle looked at each other with puzzlement in their eyes. Mallows smiled softly, but he suddenly extended his hand and seized Thales' sword hilt. Suddenly, the sin of Hell's river, which was already active, surged up, causing Thales to instinctively pull his wrist back. A huge force surged over. Mallows' expression first changed. Then he curled up the corners of his lips and let go of the sword hilt. It was as if he had discovered something. Thales took 2 steps back due to inertia and looked at Mallows in shock and bewilderment. Asterisk thud. Asterisk, there was another muffled sound. The weight-bearing wool slid off the sword again and rolled hopelessly on the sand for the last time. The captain of Thales' personal guards exercised his hands calmly and nodded slowly, as if he was still reminiscing about the contest of strength with the prince just now. But his expression calmed down, as if he had understood the truth. Thales understood something and found it increasingly hard to believe. Since 6 years ago, since the first time the strange power known as the sin of Hell's river awakened in his body, other than Black Sword, whose power came from the same source, no one had ever taken the initiative to discover his secret in the past 6 years. It did not matter whether it was his enemies in Northland and the desert, or his old friends in Constellation. Thales was also happy to hide himself and preserve his trump card, whether it was against the Star Killer, the Raven of Death, or against Shadow Shield. This trump card that he revealed at the very last moment had a pretty good effect. But Thales stared at Mallows in a daze. Today, the sin of Hell's river. Finally, he was discovered. Chapter 524. Wait, Thales thought of something. 6 years later, one of his old friends in Constellation did discover his power of eradication. It was in the Prison of Bones. But The dark purple mask flashed before Thales's eyes. He subconsciously tightened his grip on the hilt of his sword. Impossible. I told you. You're the only one who knows about the process of night training. Mallow's smiling words brought Thales back to reality. If you cheated, it's not hard to see. The watchman pointed at Thales's arm with the pleasure of catching his prey. Doyle blinked in surprise onto the other pillar, and, out of habit, he poked the person beside him. Really? The protector opened his mouth repeatedly. How old is that child? Doyle did not expect anyone to answer. But unexpectedly, this time, Glover's deep voice could be heard. Don't worry about it. According to the records, 14 years old, the Vanguard, nicknamed Zombie, narrowed his eyes. 128 days. Doyle was shocked. Damn, he's almost catching up to the youngest awakening record. Wait. But Doyle immediately noticed something. He looked at Glover strangely. How do you remember it so clearly? Glover ignored him. He just tightened his grip on his arm. His eyes were fixed on the field. While Thales tried hard to adjust his breathing and thought about what was going on at this moment, the consequences, and how he should deal with it, Mallows spoke again. The briefing about you did not mention this, so Mallows rubbed his hands and said in a nonchalant tone, when did you awaken your power of eradication? Thales was shocked again. The sin of Hell's River. It seemed unimportant, but in fact this power accompanied him through the birch tree forest, overcame the ugly-faced woman's conspiracy, survived the disaster in Dragon Cloud City, helped him escape into the desert, and brought him safely back to Constellation. It's related to the secrets, the things I experienced, be it what Blacksword told me, or what Ricky said. It's a little too much. No, I can't reveal too much. At least, I can't tell you everything. Their conversation lasted only a few seconds, and Thales did not have time to hesitate. When I was in Northland, the young Duke of Star Lake quickly thought of an excuse and organized his words while he cleared his throat. Heroic Spirit Palace is full of danger. I have to hide myself and keep my trump card. The more he spoke, the more fluent he became. A timely look of worry and vigilance appeared on his face. As for you, Lord Mallows, where did you get your brief? Mallows did not answer immediately, but stared at him for a while. The man's gaze made Thales extremely uncomfortable. A few seconds later, Mallows put on a strange smile, but he changed the subject to another question. What power of eradication do you have, Your Highness? It was an equally fatal problem. Thales furrowed his eyebrows at just the right time. He pretended to think about it, and then put on a resigned expression. I don't know either. Mallows was silent for a while before he continued to ask. What characteristics does it have? How has it changed you? The sin of Hell's River. What characteristics? What changes? Hell's senses? Thales remembered the night vision in the tunnel and the dungeon. Rapid healing? He remembered the agony of recovery on the battlefield. Damn 4D effects? Thales tried hard to push his experience in the black track out his head. Or perhaps the urge to fight like a beast? When he thought of this, Thales shook his head. He looked innocent and lost. This time, it was Mallows' turn to frown, who had been staring at his expression. So it just popped out without warning? And you don't have a clue? Thales nodded pitifully and smiled awkwardly. Something like that. Mallows looked at him, his expression becoming more and more solemn. Both of them were silent for a while. The watchman seemed to need some time to think. If I remember correctly, you only learned the Northland military sword style for building your foundation? Mallows spoke again, and his tone became cautious. Yes. Thales flashed an ugly smile. Was this also in the brief? Mallows' gaze shifted. He did not answer him, but only stared at his nominal master with a burning gaze. So what ability did you obtain? Thales subconsciously repeated, what ability? Mallows narrowed his eyes. He looked at Thales as if he was looking at a rookie. He gritted his teeth and said, when you awakened your power of eradication, did you obtain extraordinary observation skills, a sense of balance, and a sense of rhythm? I remember this is Pegasus music. Thales shook his head. No. Then, was it the thawing of glaciers, greatly increased endurance and control over force, or willpower and spirit? Thales continued to shake his head. Then, greater strength, speed, and offensive advantages? Mallows was a little unsure. Glory of the stars. Thales was still shaking his head, his gaze innocent. Mallow's expression became more and more solemn. Could it be an instantaneous burst of power that was activated in a single breath? Please don't be that. Fortunately, Thales shook his head for the fourth time. This made Mallow's brows furrow even more. Yes, not this, not that. Thales mumbled in his heart as he evaluated the effect of this lie. But the power of Eradication's version of Sharingan? Does this count? Finally, Mallows let out a long sigh and hugged his arms tightly. All right, let's assume that you did not possess any of the above four. Then, did the extensions teach you some additional combat skills that affected the awakening of your power of Eradication? Thales twitched the corner of his mouth. Extensions? I don't know. They've just been. Thales shrugged and smiled awkwardly. He tried his best to suppress the urge to beat me up in his throat, and at the same time, he uttered a few more decent words. Confrontation training? Mallow's expression became unpleasant again. He stared at Thales as if he was staring at a cunning fox that he could not catch no matter what. Finally, the watchman raised his head. Very impressive. Indeed, to be able to awaken your power of Eradication at your age. Mallow spoke words of praise, but his tone did not sound like he was praising him at all. But in truth, awakening your power of Eradication too early is not a good thing. Shortcuts often make people lazy and careless. The watchman smiled faintly, especially when you still know nothing about it. As he stared at the man's elegant and calm smile, Thales suddenly felt a little panicked. The prince tried his best to calm himself down. At least it saved me many times, especially during this journey back to the kingdom. This shouldn't be a bad thing. Once again, Mallows gave him a smile that made people uneasy. Rest for a while, Your Highness. Hydrate yourself and relax your muscles. The previous stage of training has come to an end. Thales relaxed and secretly exhaled. But Mallows turned around and called out to one of the guards who followed him. Toledo, other than those who cannot leave their posts, call everyone over. Thales' ears twitched while he sat down to drink water. The soldier, named Toledo, frowned a little. Everyone? Mallows nodded and resumed his indifferent smile. Yes, everyone from the Royal Guards or Starlight Guards. Ask them to come to the training field. His Grace will need all of their help. As Mallows said this, he slowly narrowed his eyes. Thales' hand, which was holding the water bottle, instantly froze. Toledo was obviously used to Mallows' orders. He only hesitated for a moment before he turned around and gave the order. You too, Glover, Doyle. Mallows looked into the distance with his sharp eyes. Just because you have a title does not mean that you can slack off. Glover and Doyle looked at each other at a loss. They could only walk closer. But the one who replied to the first Mallows was the prince himself. Help? Everyone in the Royal Guards? Thales looked at Mallows in puzzlement and looked around the training field. What are you doing? Mallows turned his head around and revealed a strange and evil smile that was not as indifferent and elegant as he used to be. As you wish, Your Highness. Your lessons have entered a new field. What we're going to do next is, Mallows grinned, but made Thales feel a chill in his heart. Confrontation training. Right? Confrontation. Thales was stunned for a few tenths of a second before he reacted. What? Thales pointed at the sword on the ground and found it hard to understand. Wasn't it still? But this time, Mallows interrupted him. Do you still not understand? Mallows put away his smile and stared at Thales with a sharp gaze, which made Thales instantly speechless. It would have been fine if we didn't notice. But since we discovered it, Mallows' expression became stern and extremely solemn. Then from now on, our only goal for today's training is to understand the power in your body. Mallows' expression turned cold. The truth. At that moment, in the face of the rather aggressive watchman, Thales' heart skipped a beat. He stared at Mallows' profound and complicated eyes in a daze. He was surprised and did not understand what was going on. What's going on? On the other side of the training field, Doyle walked over slowly and said to Glover in surprise, Wait, it's already so soon? Isn't it a little too early? The people in the royal guards. He did not manage to finish his sentence, because in the next moment, footsteps came from all around him. 1, 2, 3. Under the setting sun, the royal guards who were in charge of protecting the Duke surged over from all directions in Mindy's hall. Most of their gazes shone with the murderous intent of a warrior, and they looked at the two people in the middle of the training field with puzzled gazes. Glover shook his head and did not answer Doyle. "Pay attention, Your Highness. The royal guards are carefully selected." In a training field, Mallows watched as his subordinates came in a line. Among them, there are veterans who fought their way up from the battlefield in the army, and there are also talented knights who were born nobles and have been educated since young. Mallows turned to Thales, and his eyes sparkled. "Do not underestimate them." Thales tried hard to control his expression and combed through his chaotic emotions. "Is he doing what?" The watchman smiled faintly. But as I said, Mallows sighed slowly and stared at Thales' right arm, which was trying to snatch the sword from him. It's inevitable that there will be some conflicts. At the moment Mallows looked at him, Thales felt the sin of Hell's river in his body start to circulate restlessly. It was like a beast that was provoked. The prince took a deep breath and tried his best to suppress the abnormality in his body. "Is there a need for this? I'm already very tired. You do not understand your power of eradication, Your Highness." Mallows moved his gaze away. He calmly returned his greeting to his subordinate while he answered casually. "And this is very dangerous. Just like a knight who does not understand the sword in his hand or the warhorse beneath him." Mallows turned his head around slowly. "Understand yourself, Your Highness. Know yourself." His expression became serious. His gaze was so sharp that it seemed as if it wanted to pierce through Thales' armor. "Only after that will it be convenient for us to tailor the training you need. Trust me, Your Highness. This is for your own good." Mallows stared at Thales and said faintly, "And I thought, His Majesty is also concerned about your body, isn't he?" When he heard that form of address, Thales froze. Even the sin of Hell's river seemed to have stopped for a moment. Let's not let him worry when he reads Mindy's Hall's briefing. Mallows' face was expressionless. Isn't it better to understand your strength here and report the good news to him? Under Mallows' scrutinizing and skeptical gaze, Thales was speechless for a long time. The royal guards were indistinct. They were already standing around him. They were quiet, solemn, and uniform. They were only waiting for their superior's orders. Thales lowered his head and took a deep breath. He suddenly thought of an absurd possibility. Maybe, Thales thought quietly, maybe from the beginning, Mallows' goal in giving me martial arts lessons, was it not for training? "All right, Praka." Mallows turned around and called out to his subordinate in the queue. "Warm up and pick a practice sword that suits you." Under the royal guard's expressions, the watchman casually walked out of the field and showed his back to Thales. "Accompany the Duke. Let's spar." Chapter 525. "I am Leo Praka, Your Grace." One of the royal guards who walked out of the line looked to be in his 40s. He had a beard on his chin, and he looked rather comical. He bowed respectfully to Thales. "In your guards, I am a lowly and ordinary logistics officer. It is my honor to serve you as your sparring partner." Thales did not answer immediately. He continued to stare at Mallows doubtfully. Praka was not bothered. He carefully picked a practice sword of moderate size from the sword rack and tested it on his gloves. He then poked the sand to make sure that it was a blunt sword without a sharpened edge. As expected of the prince, to be able to understand the power of eradication, he made such a big fuss. Doyle looked at his fellow guards who stood around him. They were either puzzled or solemn. He cast an envious and jealous gaze at the dazed prince. "When I awakened to my power of eradication, the old knight I served knew nothing about it. That day, he exercised me until I was exhausted, and I lay on the ground moaning. It was not until a year later that he realized that his attendant's martial arts skills had improved greatly, and he could fight on par with him. Beside him, Glover did not say a word. He only paid attention to the field. Doyle was used to the other man's indifference. He only sighed quietly. But fortunately, at least Mallows knows that the prince is still inexperienced. He only chose people from the logistics division to fight. Praka's skills are average. Glover stared at Praka, who had completed a simple warm-up in the field. He frowned slightly. Thales took a deep breath. He turned to Mallows, who looked relaxed, and tried to ignore the gazes of the Star Lake guards. What should I do? Mallows smiled as usual. Attack, Your Highness. Use your full strength, especially the power of eradication that you do not understand, regardless of whether it is activated on its own or in response to the situation. That way, we will have a chance to understand its type and general situation. Let us see your strength as well, so that we can arrange to protect you in the future. Use my full strength? Thales exhaled. He felt very reluctant. Could he refuse? But the royal guards watching the battle had different gazes. All of them were focused on him. A long time ago, Black Sword had told him that it was best not to use the sin of Hell's River again. They could not bear the price of death every time. When he was in Blade Fang's camp, Ricky told him to increase the sin of Hell's River, and he looked forward to him reaching a height to push open that door. Who is right and who is wrong? What was the secret behind the sin of Hell's River? Most importantly, would the kingdom's secret intelligence department or even that person in Renaissance Palace be interested in this secret? How does it compare to mana and calamity? Thales could not help but gulp when he recalled how Zacriel chased after him. No. Thales made up his mind. The Duke of Star Lake raised his head and looked straight at his opponent. They cannot know. Your Highness, there is no need to be restrained. Praka had long since stood in the training field. The tip of his sword was pointed at the ground, and he was as respectful as ever. Don't mind me either. It's my job. Thales nodded expressionlessly. He couldn't know. Under the watchful eyes of the crowd, the prince picked up a shield from the weapons rack and fastened it to his left arm with a leather belt. He could not. Thales slowly walked to the center of the field. He glanced at Mallows one last time. The latter was still calm, but his eyes were bright and full of life. Please attack first. Praka nodded slightly. The young man's expression turned solemn. The guards around him also became solemn. All their gazes were focused on the prince alone. This was what many people were more concerned about, aside from his dazzling appearance and eloquence. In the next second, Thales charged forward, and with the stance he was most familiar with, he delivered his first slash at Praka. Praka was neither hurried nor slow. He only took a step back, turned the tip of his sword, and deftly parried Thales' attack. But the teenager did not stop. He swung the shield in his left hand along with the momentum. It crashed into Praka violently. It's obvious that this is the style of a Northlander. Doyle snorted softly while he watched the fight. There was slight disdain in his voice. He's even more extreme than the attack and defense faction. He doesn't care about his own life. However, Glover unexpectedly spoke. No. The burly vanguard observed Thales' movements with full attention. This is the ancient Northland military sword style. The current extet is no longer like this. Doyle, who was interrupted, instantly froze. He smiled awkwardly and reluctantly. TSK, you make it sound logical. Northland military sword style. Doyle curled his lips and stared at the two people in the field indignantly. Can't I tell? In the field, Thales' shield crashed into Praka and let out a dull thud. But the teenager's expression changed. He did not crash into the shield. In the next second, Praka blocked Thales' shield with one hand and spun to Thales' side. Asterisk slap. Asterisk Thales' left leg trembled. The prince swung his sword to counterattack, but the wind from the sword whistled through the air, and Praka had already retreated to avoid it. The royal guards whispered among themselves. Thales gritted his teeth and turned around. He staggered a little with his left leg. Even though Mindy's Hall's practice sword had not been sharpened, its balance, center of gravity, material, and weight did not lose to a real sword. Even though it was just a graze, Praka's strike on his left leg still caused him to feel a burning pain. Thales stared at Praka, who nodded politely, in shock and indignation. No, the sword flashed. Whoosh. The prince fell to the ground. The victor has been decided. Glover and a few guards nearby turned their heads in puzzlement. Doyle, who was by the field, lowered his voice and said seriously, The prince lay in a pool of blood with a pale face. He trembled while he hugged his injured leg and moaned. No, I can't lose. Constellation can't do without me. More and more people turned their heads around, including the second-in-command penal officer, Gray Parson. His expression was dark and dissatisfied. Under their gazes, Doyle's expression froze. A little literary processing. Doyle stopped talking and put on an awkward and ingratiating smile. He waved his hand in an unnatural manner. Don't do it again, don't do it again. Only then did everyone turn their head around. Thales breathed rapidly. He stared at the Royal Guard logistics officer in front of him with a respectful expression. His opponent, Praka, was obviously very experienced, and he was very particular about the strength he used. The pain only appeared on the surface of his skin and disappeared after a while. But Thales pressed his left leg indignantly. Looks like you don't understand the meaning of this lesson, right, Your Highness? Mallow's words came at the right time. His voice was normal, and his tone was calm. Although we are not as superstitious about force as the Northlanders, but a prince who is widely rumored to be lacking in martial arts and cannot even touch a sword is the future of Constellation. Thales could not help but tighten his grip on the hilt of his sword. Damn it, this is not good, Your Highness. Mallow's voice was slightly cold. This is not good. When he said this, the gazes of the royal guards on Thales changed. Either go all out, Mallow's words rang in his ears, or just don't touch that sword from the start. Be a prince who hides safely in the carriage. Damn it. The prince's frown deepened. Damn Mallows. Does this guy have a grudge against me? And he just had to be my personal guard captain. For Sunset's sake, what kind of international joke is this? Under dozens of gazes, Thales regulated his breathing and stomped on his left leg. He stared at Praka in front of him. He knew that in front of the Star Lake Guards, and because of Mallow's words, he had to show something. Otherwise, not just Renaissance Palace, even Mindy's Hall, Thales shook his head and got rid of his distracting thoughts. He shifted his attention to the opponent in front of him. Praka moved very quickly and wielded his sword very nimbly. He had his own way of dealing with head-on attacks. Then, as its master called, the sin of Hell's river rose from his body. Thales stared at Praka and felt power slowly fill his body. Should I use the twist of fate to lure him out of position and deliver a decisive blow? Or should I use the Fire Knight's power of eradication to strengthen the contact between our bodies and the hardness of our attacks? If that doesn't work, I'll try to use Zakriel's style and his chaotic army to observe Praka's movements and turn that into my advantage. Thales thought hard. No, Thales. The prince shook his head at himself in his heart. I can't be too obvious. Otherwise, how should I explain the twist of fate, the chaotic army, and the Fire Knight's powers of eradication that emitted sparks? Have I been infected by them? Besides, sometimes the sin of Hell's river. Thales remembered the training sessions in Heroic Spirit Palace. Sometimes I can't control it. Thales took a deep breath and made up his mind. He only needed the most ordinary enhancement to his physique. It would be best if it did not have any hint of power of eradication. The sin of Hell's river spread to his legs, arms, and fingers in an orderly manner. Thales closed his eyes and let the power slowly cover his entire body. Praka narrowed his eyes and stared at the prince in confusion. As the royal guards whispered among themselves, the expression of Mallows, who had been paying attention to Thales, changed slightly. This is the sin of Hell's river in Thales' body was like a beast that had not been released from its cage for a long time. With a low growl, it strode forward. All I need is some power, some speed, some accuracy, some control. The prince tried his best to suppress the fighting spirit and impulse that rose along with it. At the same time, he stabilized his mind and body. All I need is something that will not arouse suspicion. The sin of Hell's river pounded against his body fiercely and discontentedly, like a wild beast scratching at its cage. But the will of the cage's master was so firm that the wild beast could only follow Thales' call and walk towards where it should go. Be more even, balanced, and well-rounded. Just let him. Thales opened his eyes slightly. Let him. In the next moment, the gravel behind Thale's boots trembled and exploded, while the audience cried out in surprise. The teenager was like an arrow that left the bow in a flood that broke the dam. He instantly rushed a few feet away. He appeared in front of the shocked Praka. Mallow's eyes lit up. That's right. This is what I want. The young prince. Thales clenched his teeth. The Sin of Hell's river was extremely excited in his body and roared madly. His footsteps, shoulders, arms, and the tip of his sword. The 4 points on his body connected into a line and gathered the most surging force. In the end, it turned into a flash of sword light. It went straight for the vital parts of his opponent's chest and abdomen. At that moment, it was as if time had slowed down. I dashed. Doyle raised his hand to block the flying gravel. He opened his mouth in shock, but he could only shout out a lonely syllable in this breathtaking and instantaneous sword strike. Glover only had time to furrow his eyebrows halfway. The Royal Guard's expressions seemed to have frozen. In that instant, their expressions changed into surprise, doubt, and solemnity. But Thales, who had long since experienced it, knew that this was just an illusion after he became faster. And then, Thales' gaze met the tip of his sword. It was directed at his opponent. And before his eyes, in the slowed down time, Praka opened his mouth wide in shock. Slowly and at the fastest speed he could, he raised his arm and swung his sword. He tried to block the prince's attack. He tried to block this terrifying strike that was even faster, explosive, powerful, and accurate. But Thales knew that it was too late. Praka could not dodge in time. He did not even have time to get into a defensive posture. Even the Star Killer suffered from this strike when he was caught off guard, and a scar was left on his face. As for Praka, he could not dodge. He could not block it either. Amid the desire and roar of the Sin of Hell's river, Thales' sword and Praka's sword touched lightly in the air, and sparks flew on the rough surface of the practiced sword. There was even a great force. Thales' gaze turned cold. He watched as the tip of his sword slid past Praka's block and went straight for his chest. Sorry, logistics officer. Thales thought coldly. You need to take a few days off. One strike. Subdue the enemy. Bang! The loud sound of the weapons clashing spread and shook the entire courtyard. It was as if even the air was affected. Many royal guards' eyelids twitched, and they instinctively retreated. Time finally returned to normal. Asterisk thud. Asterisk there was a dull thud. Thales flew to the side and behind him. His back fell heavily on the ground, and he rolled a few times backwards. Shit. Doyle finally finished shouting his pitiful second syllable, and there was still a shocked expression on his face. He lowered his arm, blinked, and looked at the field. Beside Doyle, Glover did not move. He only stared at Thales' shield. While his muscles were numb and sore, the prince sucked in a breath with great difficulty. He trembled as he raised the shield in his left hand. At some point in time, the surface of a shield had already cracked. There was a dent the size of the tip of a sword as the center and the area around it was full of cracks. At this moment, Thales' mind was blank. Ow! He looked up in a daze. Praka stood before him and scathed. He pulled back his long sword with ease and smooth movements. In the air, the prince's weapon, the practiced sword that had once launched a terrifying attack, spun a few times in the air. In the end, it fell weakly. It stabbed into the sand beside his feet at a slanted angle. He did not move. Silence returned. Wow! The royal guards burst into an uproar, and a loud commotion broke out. I'm very sorry, Your Highness. Praka put away his sword and tried his best to suppress his panic. He quickly went over to help Thales and apologized anxiously. I made a mistake. Are you hurt anywhere? At that moment, Logistics Officer Leo Praka, a calm and indifferent voice rang out, but for no reason, it carried a bit of a threatening chill. Praka was about to help Thales up, but he froze on the spot. The watchman of the Royal Guards, Mallow's voice rose clearly in the crowd. As a Royal Guard, even if I have to work for a long time, even if I am just a sparring partner, Mallows still had his arms crossed over his chest as he sized up Praka from the corner of his eyes. Your skills. Mallows did not even spare a glance at Thales, who lay on the ground in a pathetic state while panting in a daze. He only stared coldly at Praka, who looked ashamed. You have also regressed too much." His words were stern, and his tone was cold. The royal guards quieted down. Praka was stunned for a moment, and he looked ashamed. He looked at the prince anxiously, then at his commanding officer. He wanted to say something, but he did not. He did not know what to do. Thales still lay on the ground and breathed in a daze. "How? The sin of hell's river. I was already, how could I still?" He sensed his left arm gradually recovering from its numbness. He also sensed the quiet gazes directed at him from all around him, and he had mixed feelings in his heart. The entire training field fell silent. The royal guards exchanged glances, and they occasionally discussed in low voices. Doyle tugged at Glover's sleeve, but the latter seemed to be deep in thought and did not react. "As for you, respected Prince Thales," Mallow spoke again. The royal guards quieted down, and Praka, who wanted to help the prince up, also stopped in his tracks. The watchman slowly turned around and looked at Thales, who was on the ground, with an indifferent expression. "After seeing your performance, I believe that you already know what the power of eradication is." Mallows chuckled, and there was contempt in his eyes. "But fighting is far more than just the power of eradication." In the next second, the watchman did not even look at the noble prince. He just turned around. "All right, everyone, the performance is over." Mallows took a step forward and said lightly, "Dismissed." As they stared at Mallow's back, the royal guards looked at each other. A few seconds later, the dozens of people dispersed. "Did you see what the prince's power of eradication is?" Doyle stole a glance at Thales, who was panting in a daze with a gloomy expression on his face. He pitied the poor prince for a second before he turned around and said, "I can't see it. I think it's a little too weak, no." Glover frowned. "It's not weak. Hey, zombie, how many times has it been? Can't you just agree with me for once?" At this moment, an exceptionally different, weak, and hoarse voice rose. "Wait a minute." The scattered royal guards fell silent at the same time and turned around one after another. At the center of the training field, the disheveled teenager pushed himself up with his hands on the sand. He staggered, but resolutely climbed up. Mallows stopped in his tracks. "He just hit my—" The teenager lowered his head and raised his left arm with a trembling hand. He tried his best to breathe, to relieve the tightness in his chest. "Shield." Doyle's eyes slowly widened. Glover's gaze became sharper. As his sparring partner, Praka stood in the field. He was shocked and did not know how to respond. "It's not a vital part." Thales sucked in a deep breath. He endured the stiffness and pain in his muscles after he suffered a heavy blow. He touched the binding straps behind his shield. In his body, the sin of hell's river, which had been defeated, surged out of silence again. With a fierce unwillingness, like a beast licking its wound, it climbed up step by step and let out muffled, explosive sounds. Thales pulled out his right hand with trembling hands and loosened the binding straps. He let the shattered arm shield fall to the ground. The teenager gulped down a mouthful of saliva that tasted like blood. He held the practice sword by his feet with trembling hands. The sin of hell's river surged into his arm. In the next moment, Thales stabilized his breathing, gritted his teeth, and drew his long sword. The teenager stared at Mallow's back. "I didn't lose." The royal guards burst into an uproar again. They cast the prince a puzzled look and discussed among themselves. Many people also quietly looked at their commander. They waited for his reaction. 1 second, 2 seconds. Mallows remained silent. He did not turn around. He only turned his neck slowly, turned his head, and cast a sideways glance at Thales. The watchman's lips curled up. He formed a cold and mysterious smile. Chapter 5:26. Your Grace, are you sure you don't need a rest? Maybe you can get a new shield, Praka said hesitantly. In front of him stood Thales, who had just stood up in a disheveled manner. He was covered in dust, his face was covered in sand, and his clothes were torn and dirty. "No, but thank you, Logistics Officer Praka." Thales took a deep breath, turned his wrist, and felt the balance and center of gravity of the practice sword. "Your attitude is much better than the instructors of Extet. Of course, it's also much better than some constellations." Praka forced a smile. Around the training field, the royal guards who had gathered again were a little impatient, but Mallow's silence made them all quiet, and they did not have any objections. The pressure was on the training field again. Thales clenched his left fist. Abandoning the shield made his left arm much more relaxed, but the numbness and pain from the previous heavy blow was so real and unforgettable. That round just now, what happened? Thales' expression darkened. He remembered that his attacks were as fast as lightning. His strength and speed were not weak. However, Thales took a step forward and moved around Praka. The sin of Hell's river roared in his body again. It rose and fell, connecting into one, yearning for a second attack. But this time, the setback gave Thales an illusion that it was becoming more and more intense, like a frenzied beast. No matter how badly it was injured, it wanted to tear the enemy's throat. But Thales suppressed them with all his might, like a beast tamer tightening a chain. As he moved, Praka also changed his steps and turned around in an orderly manner, always facing the enemy. Thales was not in a hurry to attack. He was thinking. Just now, his sword met his opponent's sword. The two swords intersected in the air, but Praka did not guard against him. If he moved forward a little more, Thales would have hit his opponent. Then Thales thought carefully. Then, in that split second, when the outcome of the battle was about to be decided, Praka's sword began to turn. It was filled with his opponent's condensed, sturdy, and thick power of eradication. And then, Thales' expression tensed. He slowed down and recalled the scene just now in the sin of Hell's river, which was burning hotter and hotter. Their swords twisted. In that 1 second, his and Praka's swords clashed together. They twisted in the air. He remembered that when the two of them got close to each other, Praka's wrist drew a strange arc. It was smooth and long. Thales' sword went off course. In Praka's sword, Thales gritted his teeth. After that, the young man who was charging too quickly could not pull back in time. He could only abandon his sword pathetically, block, and then his left arm, where he had just been hit, began to ache. Thales stopped reminiscing. This time, he didn't pace around. In the eyes of the royal guards, the prince stepped forward. As the sin of Hell's river surged into his right arm, he thrust his sword again. Dang! As the sound of metal clashing rose, Praka calmly blocked Thales' sword. Then, Thales' pupils quivered. He saw, and felt in his hand, that Praka's sword began to move again. At the same time, Kieran's power of eradication also came. The teenager did not hesitate. Thales stopped in his tracks. He withdrew the sword, which did not have much strength to begin with, and quickly retreated. Dang! There was another crisp sound. With the agility he gained after he abandoned his shield, he managed to block Praka's counterattack, and he took 2 steps back in a slightly disheveled manner. Thales panted violently. He stared in disbelief at Praka, who was still unscathed. The sin of Hell's river roared indignantly in his body when it failed to attack. After the round ended, the royal guards began to discuss among themselves again. Oh, another futile attack. Doyle looked gloomy and could not bear to watch the scene unfold. He clicked his tongue and said, "If you ask me, no matter how much Mallows dislikes him, it's still a little too much." In front of so many people, but Glover interrupted him. "No, that's not it." Doyle was puzzled. "Not what?" At that moment, a familiar voice rose in the crowd, and it made the guards quiet down again. Over the past 600 years, unique fighting skills have been passed down in the Eastern Sea and the South Coast. They are the descendants of the Southern Knights from the Empire and the Church's Knights. The voice was calm and indifferent. They were very familiar with it. Thales calmed his breathing and turned his head in surprise. The culprit who caused him to fall into such a predicament, Watchman Tormund Mallows, was standing leisurely with his arms crossed over his chest. Many families are still used to nurturing new people with a legacy of cavalier squires. It has strong local and even personal characteristics. Compared to the other martial arts in Constellation, this style is more classical and elegant. The sword styles are unique, and the techniques are exquisite and meticulous. Praka pursed his lips and turned to the commanding officer as well. Mallows said nonchalantly, "So, in the kingdom, the people who are represented by the Southeastern Knights are also known as the martial arts faction. Martial arts faction? Questions filled Thale's mind. Mallows paused for a moment and sighed slowly. Of course, due to many reasons, the once famous martial arts faction, it had gradually declined and was not as good as before. Perhaps it would eventually disappear and return to nothingness. It was just like the countless factions that flashed through the long river of history. Mallows looked up. Why are you daydreaming? Mallows reminded the two of them in a nonchalant manner, as though he was just talking in his sleep. Continue fighting. Thales took a deep breath. As he pondered over Mallows' words, he looked at his opponent again. Then, Praka, the orderly officer, stood with his sword in hand and flashed him a bitter smile. Thales did not think about it anymore. In the next second, he first moved to the left, then to the right, took a feint, and swung his sword again. Asterisk clang. Asterisk this time. Praka also moved his feet, changed the distance between them, and blocked Thales' attack. He hit his target. Thales' expression darkened slightly, but he still did not manage to hit his target. The sin of Hell's river surged in his body, and he could only roar madly in vain. He was like an orc facing a cavalry. There was no place for him to use his skills. Thales, who was at a disadvantage in his attacks, blocked his opponent, gritted his teeth, and persevered. But Mallows' words traveled into his ears at this moment, and he could not help but be distracted. Praka's ancestors came from a respectable, traditional knight family in eastern Sea Hill. They could be said to have been deeply influenced by the martial arts faction. In an instant, the contest of strength between him and Praka ended. The force on Praka's sword changed. Thales was shocked. Asterisk clang. Asterisk Praka's sword clashed with Thales' weapon for the second time. The two swords separated the moment they clashed, and only the sound of metal trembling could be heard. You can see that he has a knack for choosing his position and movement before he attacks, as well as how he chooses the strength of his sword when they clash against each other. Mallows' voice rang in the air, just like the voice of a live television broadcast in Thales' previous life. He made you very uncomfortable. Choosing his position and movement, choosing the strength of his sword, Thales shuddered slightly, but the situation before him did not allow him to think too much. He could only go with the flow and slash horizontally. Asterisk clang. Asterisk their weapons clashed for the third time. Mallows' voice followed him like a shadow. And when they're locked in a stalemate, Praka is best at listening and prediction. They clashed, and they were locked in a stalemate. Listening and prediction. When he heard this, Thales instantly felt that something was wrong. Just as he expected, in the next second, Praka's sword appeared at the spot where Thales had no time to pay attention to. He's an expert in defense and counterattack. At that moment, Thales' hair stood on end, and he activated all the sin of Hell's river in his body without caring about anything else. Asterisk clang. Asterisk he parried Praka's sword that went straight for his neck by a hair's breadth. His right shoulder landed on the ground, and he rolled away in an incredibly pathetic manner. Outside the field, Mallows smiled faintly. Just like this. After this round of exchange, the royal guard started discussing among themselves again. Thales wiped away the sweat that had appeared on his forehead without him noticing. He sensed the numbness that came from his body due to the overload. He stood up laboriously, and he was covered in dust. But this time, he did not rush towards the apologetic Praka. Instead, he looked at Mallows by the side in puzzlement. If you think that you can use the Northland barbarians' brute force tactics against him, it will be effective against him. Mallows met Thales' gaze with a piercing gaze. Then you better think twice. Your Highness. Thales panted and sank into deep thought. Leo Praka swung his long sword and said in resignation, Commanding officer, we all know that you have traveled extensively and have seen many things. But it's about time. I still rely on this to make a living. Mallows smiled, but he did not say anything else. But Thales understood something. Choosing his position, listening, prediction. It sounds like a thought appeared in Thales' mind. A name appeared before his eyes. Miranda Arund. What Waya said about her power of eradication, her Pegasus music. As he looked at his slightly awkward opponent, Thales understood. He fell into an absolute disadvantage in the first round. It was not because Praka was too strong. It was Thales clenched his fists. It was because he did not choose the right strategy. He fell into Praka's area of expertise: defense and counterattack. Think of a way, Your Highness. Mallows scratched his chin, looking bored. Anyway, the enemy is right in front of you. All right. Thales soothed his numb body and adjusted his condition. He looked at Praka again. Thales' expression became serious. The prince's attack came in the next moment. Asterisk clang. Asterisk Praka parried Thales' sword slash again, but when he was about to counterattack, he was a little puzzled. This time, the Duke of Star Lake's strength, it was very small. Asterisk swoosh. Asterisk the wind from the sword blew past. Thales took a step back and avoided his opponent's counterattack. The two of them separated again. Leo Praka. Thales thought calmly. His ancestor was a knight from Eastern Sea Hill. He was skilled in martial arts, and he specialized in defense and counterattack. His brain started to work, thinking about his opponent's advantages and his own strategy. Praka could listen and predict the opponent's strength in an instant through contact with his opponent. This was not only good for defense, but also for finding the most suitable time to attack. The fiercer the opponent's attack, the greater the force, and the more exposed, the more incisive his counterattack. In that case, the sword I used all my strength to attack just now was all useful, his opponent's counterattack. Thales felt indignant. Wait a minute. Listen and predict? Nicholas' face suddenly flashed in his mind. It flashed in the trajectory and strength of the Star Killer's blade that changed in an instant. Thales understood now. If he were to fight against the dead face, Praka would not stand chance. Because it was impossible for him to predict the Star Killer's strange skill of changing 3 times in one move just through the contact between their weapons. So, Thales gripped the hilt of his sword tightly. Twist of fate, right? With a single thought, the sin of Hell's river surged as if it had a life of its own. It wanted to turn into the silver power that resembled thousands of needles, just like it had done countless times in the past. It allowed its master to make an incredible change in an instant. Thales sucked in a deep breath. At most, I'll find an excuse to tell them that I inherited the dead face's power of termination. But the sin of Hell's river. There are so many ways, but you chose the stupidest, the least effective, the most troublesome, and the most boring one. This is your power of eradication, and it is the current you. You are forced to move forward, dragged forward, without a goal, without direction, swaying left and right, going with the flow, and even without a sense of self. Thales was in a daze. He raised his head and looked at Praka, who was smiling shyly and waiting for the prince to attack. More importantly, when you rely on imitation and ignore these things, it means that you lack the most basic things about the power of eradication that other people condensed with their lives. To every person you imitate, to every opponent you compete with, and even to yourself. More importantly, when you rely on imitation and ignore these things, it means that you lack the most basic things about the power of eradication that other people condensed with their lives. Respect. Ricky, that damned demon. Thales frowned fiercely. In the next moment, the sin of Hell's river receded like the tide, leaving behind only a bit of power with waning interest, as if it still carried a bit of nostalgia. It was like a lover who came in high spirits, but left disappointed. No, this is not a martial arts lesson. This is not a simple test of the power of eradication. It is more thorough and pure battle. Sensing the gazes of the people around him, Thales bit his lip and closed his eyes. No, if I still need to rely on Nicholas' power to survive. If I can't even get past this stage, remember, the important thing is how you are, not how strong your opponent is. How much you gain, not how much you imitate. No. If I really want to get past this stage, if I really want to get rid of this paranoid situation, Thales lowered his head. He sighed slowly in his heart. Damn it, Ricky. F***CKU. In the distance, Mallows, who had been observing Thales, had his pupils move slightly. A few seconds later, Thales raised his head. But yes. If I don't dare to try now, how much longer do I have to wait? The next time I'm in danger. At that moment, Thales threw all unnecessary worries to the back of his mind, hiding his strength, hiding the sin of Hell's River, Renaissance Palace, the Royal Guard's judgment. At least, for now, he wanted to try to be a pure warrior. He wanted to be clear of all distracting thoughts. The advantage of the sin of Hell's River's endless transformations is not that you can disguise yourself as all your opponents, but it allows you to calmly and fearlessly face all your opponents. The sin of Hell's River burned again, but it was much more docile than before. He did not know whether it was because it had used up too much energy or because it had failed too many times. It was as if that crazy beast had turned into a calm hound, licking its wounds in the corner. It only glanced at him coldly from time to time. It bared its sharp teeth at the enemies outside the cage, harboring malicious intentions. This is the omnipotent power of eradication. Thales opened his eyes slowly. The sin of Hell's River did not surge through his entire body like before. Instead, it focused on his eyes and ears, filling his senses. At that moment, the teenager entered a state he was familiar with. Hell's senses. Thales' eyes started to become unfocused, as if he had lost his focus. But only he knew. At that moment, the world before his eyes became colorful. He could see it. The power of eradication in Praka's body was thick and solid. It surrounded his arms and center of gravity as it circulated slowly. Thales suddenly realized that the countless times he used Hell's senses and the way he did it, all of them were somewhat useless. He either imitated the power, used his night vision to scout ahead, or eavesdropped through the walls, or hell with it. But the time when I should really use Hell's senses, Mallow's expression froze as he watched the battle from outside the field. Time seemed to have slowed down, and Thales inhaled slowly. He attacked abruptly. At that moment, it was as if someone had struck a war drum. The still scene moved along with the sound of an explosion. The sin of Hell's River surged again. The wind from the sword whistled and sliced through the air. Asterisk clang. Asterisk Thales held the sword with both hands and swung it down with great force. It hit the long sword that Praka had placed horizontally in front of him. The experienced Praka's expression did not change because of the sudden force from the sword. He did not panic. He faced the attack calmly and used his footwork and movement to block the attack perfectly. Then asterisk thud. Asterisk Thales' heart skipped a beat. With Hell's senses, the color of Praka's figure changed back and forth. It gathered into a clear line. A shiver erupted from Thales' neck and spread to his entire body. The meaning of imitating is understanding. Understanding your opponent. In a fraction of a second, the sin of Hell's River surged up in an orderly manner. Arm. Right leg. Thales, whose eyes looked as if they had lost focus, smoothly lifted his sword and retreated. Asterisk clang. Asterisk at that moment, he barely parried Praka's attack. The royal guards who were watching the battle gasped. Strange. Doyle was very puzzled. His movements seemed to be faster, but also slower. No, it's not his movements, Glover said coldly. Doyle was a little displeased. Why do you especially like to refute me today? In the crowd, Mallows was still silent. Thales took 2 steps back and saw that the color of Praka's body had returned to normal. The sin of Hell's River surged back like a receding tide. The sword hilt in his hand was still trembling slightly. The effects of Hell's senses were still amazing. They gave him new information at the same time. Thales took a deep breath. Yes. He could clearly feel the thick power of eradication in Praka's body, as well as its direction, shape, and habits. It seemed quiet and harmless. But once it was stimulated, it would immediately pour into Praka's hands and automatically surge towards the enemy's weakest point. He delivered a fatal strike. How amazing! At that moment, the sin of Hell's River exploded in Thales' body. It sounded like dissatisfaction, but also like a sneer. They began to strengthen Thales' body again to support the consumption of Hell's senses. Thales did not care, but he understood something in his heart. Praka's power is the thawing of glaciers. No, it's more than that. It seems to be a little like the Pegasus music that Wuxia mentioned, or something in between. There were even some traces of the chaotic army. Thales began to understand what more than one person had told him before. In different people, even if they had the same power of eradication, they would have different characteristics. That was because the power of eradication was the warrior himself. The battle was not over yet. Thales raised his sword again as he thought of Ricky's words. A swordsman who was inclined towards defense and counterattack had a power of eradication that was good at listening and predicting. And then? Observe. Thales, observe. Think again. Asterisk clang. Asterisk another round. Another exchange of blows. Thales made a light slash to the side, and in exchange, Praka turned his sword around and thrust it at the prince's backhand. The teenager dodged agilely, but this time Thales sensed it. Some hazy but crucial clues. Technique. With Hell's senses, Thales thought expressionlessly with a dazed look in his eyes. Technique. Praka. His opponent was too passive, too reliant on defense, and too reliant on these techniques for counterattacks. He was too reliant on and too concerned about his enemy's actions. Thales' eyes were dazed, but his heart was clear. He asked himself, am I like my old self? I only focused on my enemy's moves and only knew how to imitate my enemy's strengths? So, Thales closed his eyes gently. Hell's senses slowly faded away. When Thales opened his eyes again, they were clear. The power of eradication was the warrior himself. He remembered Mallow's words, though he did not quite understand it. But the battle itself was far more than just the power of eradication. Thales swung his sword in a daze, and it went straight for his opponent's waist. Praka swung his sword in an ingenious manner. The swords touched and separated again. He launched another ingenious counterattack. It was aimed at Thales' face, which he did not have time to deal with. But Thales was prepared. He left some leeway when he attacked. Hence, the sin of Hell's river flowed into Thales' waist with ease, supporting him to lean backwards and dodge the sword. Praka furrowed his eyebrows. After 2 to 3 rounds, he suddenly realized that the prince's attacks were mostly probing attacks, and his own counterattacks were no longer effective. At the moment he dodged, Thales' mind became clear. It was as if the fog had dispersed, and his blurry vision became clear. So Praka, he gave up the initiative in the battle and gave up control, in exchange for a chance for his enemy to reveal an opening. And in a battle where life and death hung by a thread, giving up control meant Thales returned to his original position. He held his sword with both hands and lowered his center of gravity. The sin of Hell's river climbed up his arms and waist excitedly. It started to roar fiercely. Like a lone wolf that had climbed to the top of a mountain, it howled at the boundless mountains and the cold moon. In the next second, Thales no longer held back. He charged forward. Asterisk clang. Asterisk their swords clashed again. Praka's gaze focused. This time, he finally received the prince's unreserved attack. This was a chance to decide the victor. He wanted to end this battle that made him feel incredibly awkward. Praka's power of eradication solidified. His wrist and arm moved at the same time. The two swords intertwined with each other, and they let out a metallic groan. He twisted his sword. Praka calmly turned the tip of his sword. In a fraction of a second, he determined his opponent's strength. Then, sensing the direction of his opponent's force, Praka's power of eradication was triggered at any moment, as if he had heard the order, just like the countless times he fought against his enemies when he was young. Parry. Judgment. The final blow. Praka thought calmly. He had not stopped moving his hands. The tip of his sword was thrust forward smoothly, and he attacked the spot where the prince could not defend against because his attack was too strong. Asterisk thud. Asterisk a muffled sound rose. At that moment, Thales only felt pain in his leg. At that moment, he could no longer hold on. His left leg went limp. Asterisk thud. Asterisk another muffled sound rose, and it was much louder than the previous one. Finally, Thales' left knee landed on the ground, and he knelt down in pain. He panted violently, enduring the soreness and numbness. The round ended. The training field quietened down. Looking at the prince kneeling before him, Praka's lips curled up. It was as expected. His sword hit the prince's left leg. At that moment, the logistics officer thought in a relaxed manner. Right, I can't go overboard. I have to leave some leeway so that the prince doesn't lose too badly, and also make the commander feel that I'm not being perfunctory. Because he offended too many people when he was young, after he was injured, his future became extremely difficult. Unfortunately, the boy and his family had reached the age of marriage. But he had no other choice. He was almost 50 years old, and he had to force a smile and respond humbly. He had to lower his head and fawn over these nobles who were in their 20s or even teens, but whose status was much higher than his. Praka's expression changed. He sensed something. Ow! The logistics officer took a deep breath. He lowered his head slowly. When he saw what was before him clearly, Praka's pupils suddenly trembled. At some point in time, Thal's sword had moved from bottom to top. He blocked it firmly, Praka's chest, and the hilt of the sword was in Thal's hand, who was kneeling on one knee. But he did not use any force. Praka was stunned. The victor had been decided. Wow! At that moment, like waves crashing against the shore, the royal guard's cries of surprise instantly rose and invaded this part of the world. Doyle looked at this scene in surprise. He wanted to say something, but he did not know what was going on. He could only open and close his mouth repeatedly. Glover's eyebrows slowly relaxed. In the field, Thales, who was kneeling on the ground, lowered his head. He was still panting violently, and his arms were trembling. Shock, excitement, curiosity, doubt, confusion, and countless other emotions rose in everyone's hearts. Among the many pairs of eyes, Mallow's gaze was the sharpest and the most complicated. He stared at Thal's sword without moving. It was as if the deepest secret was hidden there. Thales trembled. No one knew that at that moment, he was trying his best to suppress the inexplicably excited and raging sin of hell's river in his body. He was suppressing the thought of continuing to thrust his sword. Praka calmed his emotions and put away his incredulous expression. With a complicated expression, he stared at the prince who was trembling under him. He attacked intentionally, but predicted my counterattack and sacrificed his left leg. In exchange, Praka looked at the long sword in his chest with a gloomy expression. A few seconds later, the logistics officer sighed. You won, Your Grace. You were full of tricks, and your response was appropriate. Praka flashed a bitter smile. He threw down the practiced sword and admitted defeat. I was not his opponent. The discussions among the royal guards became even louder. Old Praka went easy on him, right? Against that child, Doyle whispered to the person beside him in puzzlement. He casually defeated him just a moment ago, and in the next moment, he casually defeated him again. Even a knight would not dare to write such a thing. Shut up. Glover finally seemed to be unable to hold it in any longer. He said coldly, Do you think that fighting is like doing arithmetic and comparing who is stronger or weaker? That you only need to know how to add and subtract? Doyle was rendered speechless, and he cast Glover a resentful gaze. There are many more conversations like this, but Mallows only looked at the two people in the field without saying a word. Thales panted a few more times, and he managed to stabilize his body. He put away his long sword shakily and stood up. Praka bowed resentfully, turned around, and prepared to leave the field. But Thales called out to him, No, Logistics Officer Leo Praka. The prince looked a little disheveled. His sweaty face had a smile on it. I know. You went easy on me. Thales also threw down his long sword and extended his right hand gently. You have taught me a lot. Thank you. Praka was stunned for a second, and then he smiled in a reserved manner. He hesitated for a while, but in the end, he still held the prince's hand gently. Thales nodded. I am honored to have you in my guards. The logistics officer was expressionless, but he took 2 steps back, pressed his hand on his left chest, and bowed. But compared to the first bow, he was much more respectful. I knew I went easy on him. Doyle showed an envious expression by the side of the field. TSK, 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 this veteran. That flatterer really knows how to behave. Glover glanced at him and did not say anything. The guard were still discussing among themselves, but the way they looked at the prince gradually changed. Thales picked up his water skin and started to drink to replenish himself. But as he drank, he raised his head and looked at Mallows. He threw him an unfriendly gaze. Mallows also looked back at him faintly. The emotions in his eyes were unclear. Praka? Mallows did not turn his head. There was a questioning tone in his voice. Please forgive me, commanding officer. Praka's tone was a little tired and resigned. I'm old, and the logistics officer glanced at Thales with a complicated gaze. Not bad. Mallows was silent for a few seconds, but his expression was no longer as calm and indifferent as before. Enough. A few seconds later, Mallows' slightly gloomy voice rose, and he silenced the royal guard's increasingly loud discussions. The watchman walked forward and looked at the disheveled prince, who looked like an oil painting made of sweat, dust, and wounds. He was cleaning up his mess. Are you ready to fight against your next opponent? What? Thales paused in the act of drinking water. The Duke of Star Lake put down his water skin and asked in surprise. Again? Isn't one fight enough? The 20 or so royal guard around them looked at each other at a loss. Mallows smiled faintly. We have not completed our assessment, and it's still early. The martial arts lesson did you fight for 2 minutes? Thales' words came to a halt. How many minutes was it? Mallows' smile grew brighter, but in Thales' eyes, it was incredibly detestable. Of course, we can understand that you might have had a hard time. After all, everyone's endurance is different, so you can choose to give up, Your Highness. Mallows' voice became deep, and his eyes shone with an unfathomable light. As your humble servant, I do not dare, nor do I have the right to stop you from giving up. That is your right. Mallows shrugged. Then, we can be considered to have understood you. A prince for 2 minutes? Thales was stunned again. What prince? Mallows smiled and did not answer. A few seconds later, Thales sucked in a deep breath and exhaled slowly. If you want to offend me, Tormund Mallows, the Duke of Star Lake said with a hint of anger in his voice, you did it. But I am honored, Your Highness. Mallows was not bothered at all. It means that I have done my duty. Then, have you decided to rest? I believe that everyone, including His Majesty, will understand. He glanced at the royal guard around him with a mocking expression. After all, you experienced the exciting, difficult, survival in adversity, and turning the tables in your martial arts class for 2 whole minutes. It's a world-class epic duel. At that moment, Thales, who had been staring at Mallows with a hostile gaze, twitched a little. 2 minutes. 2 minutes of what duel? Thales' expression was stiff. Mallows smiled as usual. At that moment, the training field was silent. The royal guards were silent. They did not speak a word. Everyone stared at Thales and Mallows in fear. They did not even dare to breathe loudly. A few seconds later, calm. Thales suppressed his displeasure and closed his eyes. Mallows raised his eyebrows. Thales opened his eyes swiftly, and his tone was hostile. Why are you daydreaming? Come. He clenched his teeth and urged. It's just getting beaten up. I'm already used to it. Thales roared in his heart while crying. Mallows showed a happy smile again. He did not turn around. Instead, he shouted a name. John. Yes, it's you, John Commodore. The royal guard spread out and made way for a short and strong man in the crowd. The man was stunned. He blinked in bafflement. It was clear that he was not prepared for this. His colleagues around him looked at him sympathetically. It was as if Commodore had just won the lottery to clean the toilet. Listen, John, you might as well be bolder and more intense in your actions. The watchman continued to speak. Thales was stunned. Bolder and more intense? What? What does that mean? Commodore, who was assigned to him, also looked confused. Mallows looked at Thales again, and his expression became stern. It's different from Praka's test. This time, we're going to find out what's so interesting about Your Highness. A cold glint suddenly flashed in his eyes. Power of eradication. Chapter 5:27. In the field, Thales calmed himself down a little. He felt the sin of Hell's river, which had become more active, flow through his body again. Ever since his adventure in the desert ended, he noticed that the sin of Hell's River had become more solid and abundant. Compared to the previous 10 seconds man, it could now last longer. And after the power of eradication disappeared, the fatigue and soreness it left in his body decreased correspondingly. As expected, Thales thought, things that can't kill me can make me stronger. Of course, this was not without a price. Ever since he was heavily injured by Nicholas, his left wrist was no longer as nimble as before. This more or less affected his use of a shield. And it would be even better if the sin of Hell's River's temper improved correspondingly when it circulated. Your Grace, I am John Luca Commodore. Commodore was a short and strong man. His skin was tanned, and he had a shy smile. At first glance, he looked like a middle-aged man who was almost 40 years old and had experienced hardships, but was still amiable, optimistic, and strong. Thales noticed that Commodore would subconsciously glance in Mallow's direction from time to time. I used to be a Class 1 police officer in charge of protecting important people in the police station in the inner city. When he faced the Duke of Star Lake, Commodore smiled brilliantly, so much so that it was a little obsequious. I was fortunate enough to pass the test and enter the Royal Guards. Now, I am one of the newly appointed protectors in your personal guards. Police officer. Thales sucked in a deep breath. All right, I'm quite familiar with this. Be it the arrogant green-skinned men in Western District who are in cahoots with Blood Bottle Gang. Or are they some idiots who, once they lose their jobs, will unfortunately have to go back to inherit their titles and properties? But before he could think deeply, the battle in the field had already begun. Asterisk clang. Asterisk, a muffled sound rose, and Thales' arm shield clashed with Commodore's blade. Commodore was not as humble as Praka. His attack was fierce and proactive, and it was a stark contrast to the obsequious smile on his face. Thales moved his feet and swung his longsword. He exchanged a few attacks with Commodore in the air. As the metals clashed, the Duke of Star Lake noticed through his hell senses that Commodore's sword style was standard. It was not as exquisite as Praka's, who could counter his opponent with just a few exchanges of weapons. It was also not as crude as the orcs, who could attack in a wide range and never return. The two of them attacked and defended, advancing and retreating. For a time, they were evenly matched. This surprised Thales quite a bit. But dang! Once again, Thales used his arm shield to block his opponent's attack. He gritted his teeth and steadied his footsteps. The sin of Hell's River surged forth at full force, and he pushed the man away without showing any sign of weakness. But at that moment, Thales cursed in his heart. He felt that his opponent's sword was as light as a feather and didn't seem to be straining at all. As expected, Commodore nimbly avoided the shield in front of Thales and turned his sword on the shield. In the next second, the sin of Hell's River exploded in his body again, bringing with it an indescribable feeling of fear. But Thales only had enough time to turn around. Dang! Dong! The crisp sound of metal colliding and the dull sound of flesh being blasted rang out. Oh! In the midst of the Royal Guard's locomotion, Thales gritted his teeth and staggered backwards. He knelt down on one knee and supported himself with a shield. The pain and numbness in his shoulder told him the round was over. Commodore, who was a former police officer and was now a protector, smiled foolishly and nodded. He put away his practice sword and did not continue attacking. It's the hilt. Thales panted in pain. He turned his aching shoulder socket and arm desperately and told himself this. At that moment, he used his shield to push away Commodore's sword, but he did not manage to block his opponent's sword hilt. The cross-shaped handguard on his sword followed him like a shadow. He seized the chance when Thales pushed his shield forward and pushed his arm forward to spin at Thales. If Thales had not reacted in time, he might have been hit in the ribs under his arm. Then, he would basically be lying on the ground. But even so, Thales sucked in a deep breath. My shoulder socket. It's terrible. There were also moves in the Northland military sword style that used the hilt to subdue the enemy. But most of them were used when both parties were in a stalemate and other methods could not work. There were very few people like Commodore who set up everything just so he could use the hilt. Doyle blew his hair towards the sky and nudged Glover by the side of the training field. Oh, this move of Gene's. I saw it when he bullied the newbies in the defense division. In any case, he is not easy to deal with. Glover snorted softly. The spectators from the Royal Guards discussed softly, and some of them laughed faintly. Mallows, who was watching the fight, turned his head to the side and seemed to be deep in thought. Commodore did not chase after him. Instead, he waited patiently for the Duke to regroup. "I am very sorry, Your Grace." He held his long sword in his hand, and his smile did not diminish. "But I believe that you do not want me to hold back, do you?" "Damn it." Thales exhaled and felt the sin of Hell's river surge into his shoulder to relieve the numbness and pain. It was only then that his left arm felt slightly better. Gene fought his way up in the police station. Mallow's voice, which was no longer unfamiliar to him, rose again. He has a lot of experience in the streets and alleys. Strictly speaking, his skills belong to the new trend of practical warfare in the country over the past 100 years. It is especially popular among mercenary knights and nobles who develop new lands. It is known as the new trend. Thales turned his head around. As expected, the watchman had his arms crossed over his chest, and he looked like he was watching a good show. And in the past few decades, the new trend knights have also gained a lot of experience from the wars in the country and abroad, including mercenaries. They only seek to be suitable for the battlefield, to win, and to survive. Because of this, their style is flexible, and they do not stick to traditional methods. Of course, the new trend is also often criticized by other schools of thought. They say that their methods are disorderly, their style is messy, they are short-sighted, and they have no focus. The watchman chuckled softly. Conversely, it is also the hardest to deal with. You never know what surprises are waiting for you. New trend. Thales slowly followed his breath and focused his attention on Commodore again. The man still had that simple and honest smile. Mercenary? As Thales pondered, he suddenly thought of a person. Black Sword. The teenager remembered how he defended, escaped, lured the enemy, searched for an opportunity, and subdued the enemy on the cliff of the sky in Dragon Cloud City. He remembered how he used all sorts of methods to fight against the air mystic and not being at a disadvantage. He also remembered how he carried him. Thales had been trying to find a better transitive verb in the Sea of Blood and Shield district while he charged towards the multi-headed monster, Kalika. As he thought about it, the sin of Hell's river surged again, as if it was dissatisfied with the humiliation it suffered in this round. "Commanding officer, you praise me too much. I'm just a—" Commodore responded to Mallows with a chuckle. But before he could finish speaking, Thales' attack arrived before him again. Asterisk clang. Asterisk Thales gritted his teeth and attacked with his sword, but it was blocked by Commodore in a practiced manner. Commodore then pressed forward and thrust his sword forward. The teenager knew that Commodore had all sorts of methods up his sleeves. He swung his sword to parry the attack and retreated agilely to prevent himself from being hit again. But in the next moment, his Hell's senses suddenly shuddered, and an ominous feeling surged into him again. As expected, Thales felt a jolt in his leg. He lost his balance. Damn it! The sin of Hell's river roared. Without thinking, Thales used all his strength to turn around and roll out of the battlefield in a pathetic manner. Asterisk thud. Asterisk Commodore's knee landed heavily on the sand, and it let out a frightening thud. After this round, the Royal Guards let out a low commotion again, but at least the teenager managed to avoid it. Thales crawled up in shock and looked at Commodore, who had a slightly surprised look in his eyes. "Trip me?" Thales really wanted to ask whether Commodore had learned how to wrestle, or whether he knew a former watchman who also liked to trip him in close-quarters combat. But Thales took a deep breath and straightened his body. After this round, he understood something. Thales did not recognize Commodore's power of eradication, but he could feel that, with his Hell's senses, Commodore's power of eradication had already taken form the moment the two of them came into close contact. It gathered in a certain part of his body and was ready to be unleashed. For example, his wrist and sword hilt, his waist, and his footsteps. Coupled with his little tricks, he could instantly unleash his power of eradication and catch his opponent off guard. And it's not just his power of eradication. Thales panted and stared at the opponent in front of him. It's just like what Mallows said: street skills, flexible style, unconventional style, and a mixture of different styles. The sin of Hell's river began to burn again, and it was even more vigorous than before. How should I face such an opponent? Thales took a deep breath and patted the dust off his body. It's not that difficult, is it? At that moment, a figure from many years ago appeared in his memories. That figure raised a golden saber and stretched out his burly body. He treated himself as a weapon. That figure descended from the sky. He was ferocious and unyielding. He ignored his opponent's various tactics and withstood his countless attacks. That figure's expression did not change. He did not hesitate at all. He broke through Ralph's obstructions, countered Waya's killing move, broke Raphael's weapon, knocked away Miranda's attack, and suppressed Cohen, who was fighting with all his might, until he was forced to retreat. He could not fight back at all. In the end, he arrived before Thales. He was like a wild horse that was burning with flames as it charged forward. He charged forward recklessly. He was unyielding and ferocious. He charged forward with an indomitable spirit. He broke through all obstacles. Thales closed his eyes. The sin of Hell's river was self-taught. It followed his thoughts and was about to imitate that figure's power of eradication, but it was suppressed by Thales halfway. No, Thales was not Tolja. He was not the Fire Knight. His opponent's power of eradication might not be as effective against him. He could not afford to use up so much of his energy. And Commodore was not one of the 5 people who were defeated in an instant. But in the next second, Thales opened his eyes. The sin of Hell's river burned continuously and let out crackling sounds. It was like a faint sneer. Commodore maintained his smile as he watched the Duke charge at him again. The royal guard around them watched as the 2 figures approached each other again, but they were not very focused. Some of them even yawned. Asterisk clang. Asterisk the 2 swords clashed. Commodore smiled faintly. He used a twisting sword that had the charm of Praka's defense and counterattack to launch a counterattack. In his Hell's senses, Commodore's power of eradication was ready to be unleashed. Asterisk thud. Asterisk Thales' shield blocked Commodore's blade again. This time, Commodore's sword suddenly trembled. Thales immediately felt that the shield was weak and powerless. He also felt the shudder that the sin of Hell's river reminded him of. As expected, Commodore smiled. His long sword cleverly bypassed Thales' shield and went straight for the teenager's sword-wielding hand. But this time, Thales' mind was clear. He suddenly understood a little. How to fight. It was the same as what he had come to understand in the past few years when he was shuttling back and forth in different political whirlpools and struggling to survive in different desperate and dangerous situations. What was important was not power, weapon, tactical skills, or even the power of eradication. It was people. People. His opponent's power of eradication was the same as Commodore himself. He seemed simple and honest, but he was actually sly and smart. He always thought of ingenious countermeasures beforehand, and when the time came, he would follow the prescribed order and reap the fruits of his labor. But the sin of Hell's river surged up and filled Thales' left arm. In the next second, Commodore realized to his surprise that the prince did not dodge or avoid the attack. He used the most disadvantageous position to receive his sword. Thales' face was filled with pain. He could not withstand it, and his long sword fell from his hand. The guards let out soft cries of surprise. Some of the people who had some expectations for the prince shook their heads. All right, this is the same as admitting defeat. Commodore thought in pity. He moved his body to avoid the Duke, who had lost his weapon. He still had a lot of close-quarters combat skills, but he could not show them. But forget it. I was going to lose anyway. But Commodore's thoughts stopped at this moment, because in that second he saw to his surprise that Thales' shield, which was still attached to a few straps, smoothly slid down. It revealed his left arm, which was already clenched into a fist, and the Duke's gaze. Commodore stared blankly at Thales' face, which showed that he was enduring the pain with great difficulty. Asterisk thud. Asterisk another dull sound rose. The teenager's left fist struck Commodore's right rib violently. The strength was astonishing. At that moment, Mallows, who was watching the fight, furrowed his eyebrows. Commodore felt half of his body go numb. He could not feel his right arm. Just as he thought that things were not going well, the Duke's face, which was gritting his teeth, grew larger in his field of vision. Asterisk thud. Asterisk Commodore felt pain in his forehead. He saw stars and lost his balance. Asterisk thud. Asterisk both of them fell to the ground. Two dull sounds were heard. Thal's shield and Commodore's longsword fell to the ground. A few seconds later, everyone snapped out of their daze. Commodore was already lying on the ground. The former police officer was shocked and angry. He struggled to get up, but he realized that at some point in time, Thales was already sitting on top of him. Your Grace? The teenager pressed his left hand against Commodore's neck. His right arm, which had his longsword knocked out, was dragged by his side. It was trembling slightly. The crowd, who had already relaxed, let out stifled cries of surprise again. Mallows was deep in thought by the side of the field. He would occasionally turn his head to say something to a guard beside him. You did very well, Protector John Commodore. Thales panted as he looked at Commodore, who looked ashamed and angry. He revealed a weak smile. But you relaxed in the end, and I had the opportunity to take advantage of it. The exhausted teenager stood up while trembling. He looked at Commodore, who was too ashamed to show his face. A small hint. Don't do this, especially when you are facing orcs. Commodore crawled up in a submissive manner. He did not even dare to look at Mallows. He apologized incoherently and left in a hurry. It was only then that Thales exhaled. The sin of Hell's River was still surging in his blood vessels. Its momentum was like a flood behind a dam. It was waiting to pour down at any moment. But at least Thales stopped attacking. The teenager staggered backwards and turned around. He panted as he picked up the water skin to quell the surging sin of Hell's River. Even though John went easy on me, how should I put this? Doyle narrowed his eyes and looked at Commodore's back, who was too ashamed to face the crowd. In a real battle, John will lose his throat, but our prince will also lose his right hand. Doyle shook his head in resignation. This desperate move, and the method he used against Praka. As expected, our prince came back from the north. However, no. Glover spoke coldly, and his answer was simple. In a real battle, the prince will lose some saliva. Doyle was stunned. What? Saliva? Glover stared at him with a burning gaze. Then, John will be crippled by all of us who will charge at him together. While the crowd discussed among themselves, the two of them were silent for a while. What you said is... Doyle blinked before he nodded awkwardly and continued the conversation. Is it really that real? Glover ignored him and turned his head around. But I still can't tell. Doyle stared at Thales and asked in puzzlement, does he really have the power of eradication? But if he doesn't, how did he do it? Under the crowd's gazes, Thales took a deep breath and put down the water skin. He sensed the emptiness and excitement in his limbs after the sin of Hell's River faded away. He ignored the crowd's discussions and sizing them up. He looked at Mallows, who did not say a word. Is it enough? Have you confirmed my power of eradication? Thales said in annoyance. My dear leader of the personal guards? Everyone's eyes were focused on Mallows. The watchman discussed with the guards beside him before he looked at Thales. I think I have some clues, Your Highness. He narrowed his eyes. But I can't confirm it yet. Thales exhaled. Some clues. Can't confirm it? That means, as expected, Mallows nodded and raised his voice to give an order. Mike, you go. As soon as he said this, the guards exchanged surprised and bewildered gazes. Soon, a man in his 30s walked out from the guards. His face was smooth, his eyebrows were gentle, his clothes were neat, and he was meticulously groomed. Thales sighed again and lamented about how time passed so slowly. Are they going to take turns fighting me? Oh no, he's no longer calling the people from the defense division and the logistics division. Doyle's expression changed, and he pointed at Mallows at Glover. This is not a good sign. The man in his 30s came to the center and bowed respectfully. Mike Johnvold, Your Highness. Knight Johnvold, who is known as Mike, might be gentle and elegant, but his accent had a roughness that Thales was familiar with. I officially joined the Royal Guards 9 years ago. Thales nodded in resignation and returned the greeting. Jonvald's words were concise and cautious. By the way, I am left-handed. Jonvald untied the sword he wore on the opposite side of his body and picked up a practice sword from the weapon rack. My attacks will be more violent and unexpected. Be careful. Thales flashed a weak smile and began to dress again. Wait, Jonvald, this family name. Doyle scratched his head by the side. I seem to remember something. Glover, who was beside him, silently replied, Black Jonvald. Black what? Doyle looked puzzled. Glover did not even look at him. He only said quietly, the Executioner family during the Red King's era was once among the 7 Jade Star's attendants. There were more than 3 titled counts who died in their hands. Until the virtuous king was crowned, and during the rebellion trial, they were convicted one by one. They were held accountable for their crimes, and their titles and fiefdoms were taken away. Doyle looked as if he had just come to a realization. Glover was expressionless. But you should know better than I do. Doyle frowned again. Why? Glover slowly turned to Doyle. Because of Black Jonvald and White Doyle. Doyle was slightly stunned. The Red King had 2 attendants, and the widow cried day and night. Glover said coldly, 200 years ago, your family was as famous as them. Danny Doyle blinked. Wow. After a while, Doyle turned his head around in embarrassment and numbness. Is that so? You even know this? While they were still chatting, Thales had already gone up against Jonvald's sword. Just like Commodore, Jonvald did not hold back at all. He took the initiative to attack. But this time, Thales' expression changed the moment his opponent delivered his first attack. Jonvald was different from his previous 2 opponents. Clang, clang, clang. 3 sharp sounds rose. Jonvald's expression was calm. The sword in his left hand moved quickly, and he continuously threatened Thales' chest, calf, and arm. After blocking 3 times, Thales was forced to take 3 steps back. He was surprised and strenuously resisted his opponent's attacks. Compared to the older Praka and the short and sturdy Commodore, the knight with the outstanding appearance was expressionless. His attacks were simple and direct, and there were no flourishes. With a familiar feeling, Thales did not even have time to catch his breath. Before he could stabilize his footing, Jonvald's attack arrived again. The sin of Hell's River roared indignantly and surged into Thales' arm, but it could only support him in quickly defending himself. Clang! Jonvald's expression was indifferent, but the long sword in his hand became swifter and swifter. He did not deviate and went straight. The tip of his sword was aimed at the parts that Thales found difficult and unstable during his previous defense, his legs and wrists. He attacked continuously. The worst thing was that Thales rarely fought against enemies who held swords in their left hands. In his opinion, every time Jonvald attacked, the angle of his attack was tricky, unexpected, and difficult for him to defend against. But his attacks were also very forceful, causing him to have a hard time defending himself. He could only retreat continuously to avoid the attack. It was to the extent that Thales almost lost his footing during his 8th defense. He did it while he leaned back in a pathetic manner, and he was close to his limit. Even so, Thales' arm was still grazed an inch by his opponent's blunt sword, which had not been sharpened. It was incredibly painful. But before he could rest, Jonvald's next attack came from the spot where he was grazed. Thales was forced to grit his teeth and activate the sin of Hell's River. Perhaps it was because he was almost driven mad by the repeated setbacks, but he retreated. And every time he took a step back, Jonvald's advantage in his next attack would increase a little, causing Thales' defense to become more and more dangerous. Thales felt the tremors on his shield and sword, as well as the pain and numbness in his muscles. The more he fought, the more fearful he became. He was constantly being attacked, and he did not even have the chance to counterattack. Thales could not help but be reminded of his time in heroic Spirit Palace. The Northlanders' attacks were also as violent and swift as this. They did not give him any chance to catch his breath. Jonvald's attack had clearly shocked the royal guards and the spectators. Many of them pointed at him and discussed about something. Even Mallows nodded repeatedly as he watched. What the heck? By the side, Doyle widened his eyes. There's such an amazing person in our team. Even Glover was rather surprised. Either his opponent is too weak, or he's hiding his strength. When I was in Renaissance Palace, I never heard of such a person in the Vanguard Division. But compared to the spectators who were pleased with themselves and commenting on the fight, Thales was not in a good mood. He gritted his teeth and used his shield to withstand Jonvald's full-powered slash. Then he activated the Sin of Hell's River at all costs and finally launched a counterattack. At least he managed to force Jonvald's attack to slow down. But his opponent only paused for a moment. His face did not turn red, and he did not pant. Then, he attacked again and dragged the fight back to its previous rhythm. Thales was about to go crazy. At that moment, he was like a small boat floating in a stormy sea. He was doing his best to tug on the sails to ensure that the boat would not capsize. But the water at the bottom of the boat was getting deeper. He could not hold on anymore. But his opponent's power of eradication was endless. With Hell's senses, Thales could even see his opponent's skin shining like stars. Your Highness, you should be very familiar with this style, right? Soon, that familiar but very annoying voice rose. When Mallow's voice faded away, Jonvald withdrew his sword and retreated with ease, perhaps because it was related to him or because he respected his superior. He stopped attacking. Thales finally had a chance to catch his breath. He did not have to defend himself so hard anymore, so he panted heavily. At the same time, he placed a shield and long sword on the ground. The Sin of Hell's River seized the opportunity and surged into his body, relieving his soreness and the small injuries he suffered during the battle. Mallow spoke slowly and nodded at flag-bearer Fubby beside him. Although he was born in the Central Territory, Mike had a cruel stepmother. He was sent to a poor relative's house in the Northern Territory when he was young. He was raised by a knight of the Northern Territory. As soon as he finished speaking, many guards cast their gazes at Jonvald. Sir, you're actually... Mike Jonvald forced himself to smile. Don't mention stepmothers. Mallows smiled apologetically. He then looked at Thales and said with a serious expression, That's right. Since the establishment of Constellation, the martial arts of the Northern Sect have been passed down among the knights of the Land of Cliffs and the Northern Territory. They have absorbed the experience of fighting against the extensions over the years, and after years of accumulation, they formed their own school. Thales panted in pain and shook his head at Mallows to show that he had heard him. They have the advantage of the Northland barbarians in seizing the opportunity to attack and advocate suppression, but they also retain the traditional skills of Constellation's knights. They work hard to achieve a balance between offense and defense, and they complement each other. They pay special attention to the transition between offense and defense, as well as their determination during critical moments. There was delight in Mallow's tone. Hence, the Knights of the Northern Sect in the Kingdom are also known as the Attack and Defense Sect. Their offense is fierce, and their rhythm is fast. Their transitions between offense and defense are smooth. When they fight against them, if they are careless, they will suffer a crushing defeat, and they will lose everything. Northern Sect? Attack and Defense Sect? Their offense is fierce, and their rhythm is fast attack while defending and defense while attacking. Thales' breathing became smoother. He raised his head in puzzlement and looked at Jonvald, who was not panting at all and was fighting with ease. Jonvald nodded at him respectfully. As for the typical representative among them, Mallows crossed his arms in a relaxed manner and gave a nickname that made many people fall into deep thought. I believe that you must have heard of the Kingdom's Wrath. Thales froze for a moment. Kingdom's Wrath? Many years ago, the scene of him breaking out of the Broken Dragon Fortress flashed in his mind. If one was careless when facing an enemy, it was a crushing defeat, a complete loss. The prince took a deep breath. Hee. The corners of Thales' lips curled up. He had more than heard of it. But wait a minute. Thales stared at Jonvald and narrowed his eyes. No, not just the Kingdom's Wrath. He was not the only one. Several different figures appeared in front of him. They were Barney Jr., who was fighting for his life in the dungeon, and Bruley, who had lost the ability to speak and was charging around like a bear. It was them, Knights of the Northern Faction, right? Finally, Thales took a deep breath and stood up. Let us see, Your Highness. Mallow smiled faintly. Over the past 6 years, when you faced extension-style martial arts, Mallow's eyes shone brightly, and it shot straight at Thal's sweaty face. How'd he deal with it? Stealing fragrance. You're tuning in to the Eternal Immortal Ballad YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.